Welcome to Orthodox Christian Theology. This is Craig Trulia, and with me now is Evangelos. How are we doing?
I'm very well. Yourself?
Good, thank God. Blessed feast, everyone who is on the old calendar. And this is a real pleasure for me to do today. It's might be my most exciting interview ever because it's about something I've been sort of a topic I wanted to cover, but really couldn't, which is the authenticity of the Dionysian corpus. And in your translation of the life of the Saint Dionysius the Areopogite from Scriptorium Press, the link is below for people that want to check it out, and it's also on Amazon, is the first time I've read a, as they say on the internet, non-cope, a real vigorous defense of the authenticity of the Dionysian corpus. And even in my own research, which is why I have not spoken about this subject, I found my own objections to be addressed by this, and very precise etymological objections addressed by your very thorough but concise introduction to this life, which, by the way, even though we're not talking about the actual life of St. Dionysius so much, in this stream, I love hagiography. So if you love hagiography, it's really, really good. It also, I find the more you read hagiographies, the more you understand how they all connect. So what's it, like $14, $15? I bought a couple copies for friends already. Please, great stocking stuffer. It's not very expensive. It's an excellent book. And I don't know. I think it's just great that you get to do the big grand opening per se on this channel. So how about you tell us a little about? Yeah. So I don't know. I'm going to shut up for a bit because this interview is about you. So how about you tell us a little about why you chose the life of St. Dionysius, specifically what Scriptorium Press is about, and then we'll start getting into the authenticity of the Dionysian corpus.
Absolutely. So as I've mentioned to you, my background, I've studied linguistics and classics, and the co-founder of the company as well, Anthony, he has a master's in classics. So we both have this interest in ancient texts and medieval culture and religion. So we wanted to do something where we would convey these old ideas to modern audiences who don't necessarily read the original languages. And when we were looking for text to translate and present, initially we were thinking of doing more theological writings or rare things that haven't been translated. But then we had the idea to do saints' lives, which is sort of an untapped area, I find, of medieval writings. And in the process of looking for something interesting to translate that wouldn't be excessively long, we happened upon this great life of Saint Dionysius, which was written as a homily. He was delivered as a homily around 830 by Michael Sinculus, who was a candidate at some point for Patriarchate of Constantinople, but he was too humble, so he refused the position. He was persecuted by the last iconoclast emperor, so he delivered this sermon in exile. And it was just a very, very well composed and interesting life. But we noticed in the process of working on it that Sinculus uses the Dionysian corpus as a source for his biography, and he assumes that it's authentic, which goes contrary to the modern academic opinion about these writings. So we thought it would be useful to a general audience to include an introduction to this life, addressing why these writings have been questioned, what they are, and just look a bit into that. But as you know, it's a vast topic, so this small introduction over time grew into a whole a treatise in itself. So that's how we ended up with this big, thick book. So about half of this, or like 3/4 almost, is just looking at the authenticity of the text, and then.
But that's common in translations, right? You'll get like this short little text in the end, but the whole introduction's the whole book. But I would say, unlike those books that are just doing it to you to charge you money, this this introduction is worth its weight in gold.
Thank you.
It's very important, and it's hopefully something you'll make more concise and publish academically. And the reason being is it's got up-to-date scholarship. It really does get into the languages. It is very, very good.
Thank you.
And so, it's, guys, you could go to Scriptorium Press to find out there's more books than just St. Dionysius. So how about you just tell us real quick, what other Lives of Saints do we have translated and what's in the pipeline?
Absolutely, yeah. So we have them here. There's still the proof copies because they came out last Friday. So they have a watermark, but this is basically the book. So one of them is The Life of St. Bede the Venerable, the great English father and historian. This is a much shorter life. So this is also translated from Latin, but it's the first translation in English. So it's an interesting read. We also have the Conversion of Saint Cyprian, which people in the audience, they might know it as the Life of Saint Cyprian and Justina, Saint Cyprian being the sorcerer. So, but this is the unabridged Acts of Saint Cyprian. So it's the like original 4th century Greek text that we've translated. And then we have the Life of Saint Nilus the Younger, another little known life, but it's quite exciting. You have a lot of action and a lot of great ascetic feats and battles with demons and political intrigue. So this is what's currently available. And then in the new year, we're going to be coming out with a commentary on Ruth, Esther, and Judith, which was written in the 9th century. It's the first and only patristic commentary on these books. And it's a verse by verse commentary, which was written by Rabanus Maurus, who's a Carolingian commentator and monk. And it's an allegorical explanation of how the lives of these Jewish women in the Old Testament are foreshadowings and reflections of the incarnation and the church in the New Testament.
And so tell me exactly, what's the deal with the mashup of Scriptorium Press? So you're Greek Orthodox. Anthony is traditional Catholic. It sounds like you're the original cast of Reason Theology. So how did that get big?
Well, we have, very common interests, and the texts we pick, I think they have an appeal, even I would imagine even just to Anglicans or to anyone who's interested in history or church history or medieval history. So they're they're very old texts, and they're like a lot of even the texts that we've translated, a lot of them they're found within the Vita Sanctorum series, which was composed by the Catholic Bollandists in the 18th century. So it's really not a question of East or West. It's they have a universal appeal, I would say.
And that's always a good business model. You go with what everyone likes, right?
Yeah, for sure.
So let's now jump into Dionysius. Now, for those who are aware, and also for those under a rock, most scholars believe that that Dionysius, the Dionysian corpus, there's letters, several books. Within the Dionysian corpus, there's mention of other books that had just been lost to history or never invented by the pseudonymous writer. And usually the main reasons people will say it's not really written by Dionysius is the two main reasons is, well, there's major Greek parallels with Proclus, which obviously we're going to get into. And the other is it had no existence whatsoever until it suddenly appears pretty much in the early 6th century. And those are the common reasons. And so during this interview, we're going to get into details, which we'll call those major reasons, call those to task. And that will allow Evangelos to then make the case that, well, with those not being true, here's why this is something that's authentic. Now, I think maybe the most accessible question on this whole topic is, why do I not read St. Cyprian or St. Irenaeus or whomever and see them quote Dionysius. You think, well, like, they will quote St. Ignatius, even Dionysius quotes St. Ignatius, right? So we know from other early texts, they'll quote earlier people. So my question to you then, on a very basic level, is why do we not have early fathers quoting Dionysius, and is that true?
Yes, excellent question. So simple answer is Dionysius is quoted by earlier fathers. He's sparsely attested, but he is quoted. So it's incorrect to say that the first time these writings appear is in the 6th century or 5th century. So the earliest surviving witness that we have of St. Dionysius is a fragment from a commentary that was written on the corpus by St. Dionysius of Alexandria, which is preserved by St. Maximus, who had access to a lot of ancient writings from Alexandria that are not lost to us. So he, is quite explicit, and he says that Dionysius of Alexandria was writing these commentaries on Dionysius of Athens, his namesake. So there doesn't seem to be any area for confusion there.
And I want to underscore that so people are aware. The Dionysius of Alexandria, the Bishop of Alexandria that came more than 100 years after Dionysius the Areopogite, all we have of his works are in fragments. And so if one were to discount the evidence, well, it's just a fragment, then we might as well throw out everything Dionysius of Alexandria ever wrote. However, what you show is that we have a fragment of Dionysius of Alexandria preserved by St. Maximus, right? So someone in the 7th century had their hands on a work that's written in the 3rd century. And that 3rd century work explicitly says, I'm going to comment on something from Dionysius the Areopagite.
Yeah.
And so that would be pretty clear evidence that there were known writings of Dionysius the Areopagite in the 3rd century. Would that not be?
It's very powerful evidence, and it's routinely ignored in modern scholarship. And in fact, when the authenticity of the writings was first questioned seriously in the 15th century, Lorenzo Valla, who was this Italian humanist who was the first to question these, he relied on the Latin fathers. So he wasn't even aware that this testimony existed. And then what happened was the snowball effect was created where a lot of the early Protestants, like Luther, started jumping onto this bandwagon saying, oh, you see these writings, they're with all their references to sacraments and bishops, these are just later falsifications, and they would all refer back to Valla and Erasmus. But the irony is that this position became entrenched before the actual a full review of the evidence of what the ancients actually say was made.
And just so people aware, this similar treatment was given to St. Ignatius' Antioch's corpus, which was pretty much considered fraudulent in the 16th century. And it's just not a tenable position because St. Justin Martyr and St. Irenaeus quote him. And so this is analogous that, maybe it's not someone in the 2nd century, but we have a good authority in the 3rd century that cites the existence of the Nicene corpus. Mm-hmm. But so do we have any other explicit examples or at least approximated quotations in early pre-Nicene sources?
Yeah, so there's one other explicit example and then 2 other heavy allusions and a whole bunch of lexical parallels in writers of the 2nd, 3rd, and 4th centuries. So briefly, just to give you a summary, we go into all this in the book. But so we have Dionysius of Alexandria. Then right after him, the person to quote the Areopagite by name is Patriarch Juvenal of Jerusalem, who lived at 451. He was patriarch at the time of the Council of Chalcedon. So he actually mentions Dionysius the Areopagite in a letter to the empress, and even quotes from the Divine Names, one of his treatises. There's an allusion also in St. Gregory the Theologian, where he basically quotes lexically an interpretation from the celestial hierarchy about the angels, and he doesn't say it's by Dionysius, but he says, as one of our predecessors has most loftily pointed out. So it's
and so let me underscore that. It's like in the scriptures, they don't only say in the book of Psalms it says or something, but it'll say it is written or
Yeah.
Scripture saith or something like that. And so we, as you're stating, Saint Gregory essentially quotes something as a paraphrase from Dionysius, and he makes it clear it's not just from himself. He says, as the father has stated, or as the father had stated.
Yes, yes.
So he's clearly quoting something, and the only thing that matches what he's quoting is from the Dionysian corpus.
That's right. And then not only that, but just in the paragraph immediately preceding this quote, you have other lexical parallels. So it seems like that whole homily, or the part of that homily that he delivered, that oration rather, is infused with Dionysian language. So there's a lot of evidence pointing to that. And then so then another allusion occurs in a sermon attributed to St. John Chrysostom, where he doesn't say Dionysius the Areopogite, but he's in the process of praising some early church fathers. So he mentions Evodius, who was the second bishop of Antioch, mentions Ignatius, Hippolytus, so some early fathers. And then he mentions in the midst of this list certain Dionysius, who he calls the bird of the sky. So that's thought to be a reference to his very elevated theology, similar to how in the symbolism of the church we often see St. John the Evangelist, he's associated with the eagle. So this idea of like the bird flying high and apprehending the divine. And even the critics agree that this is a reference to St. Dionysius the Areopagite, but they say, oh no, but this treatise, this sermon can't be by St. John Chrysostom, and they come up with some reasons. But in the book, we offer reasons why this is very likely a treatise by St. John, and
also not an interpolation based upon where it's located in the text, right?
Yes, it's it seems to be like an authentic reference.
And so, which would show that in the late 4th century, that somehow, even if it's just for hagiographic reasons, that Dionysius the Areopagite had a reputation, a theological reputation of some sort. Well, how do you have this reputation if there's no writings to get that reputation from?
Yeah.
So that is very compelling. Now, before we get into some nitty-gritty about the euthymaic history, because people weren't aware that story of St. Juvenal and what he relates from Dionysius is from that source. How about any other etymological evidence from fathers like Clement Alexandria and people like that?
Absolutely. So you have specifically, this is another interesting point. All these references to St. Dionysius, 90% of them in the early centuries, before the writings became really popular and well-known, they all seem to be localized in Alexandrian writers. So you have Pantaenus of Alexandria, who was one of the deans of the school there. You have Clement of Alexandria. You have Origen. We mentioned Dionysius of Alexandria. And we could even say Saint Gregory the theologian. In a sense, he's an Alexandrian writer because he studied theology there, and he's influenced by Origen. Even the Neoplatonist Plotinus, he was from Alexandria, and there's one passage in his philosophical writings, which is like an almost word for word quote from what you find in Dionysius. So you have very clear lexical parallels and expressions that you can't really attribute them to chance. So I'll give you an example for the audience as well. Clement of Alexandria, at one point in his writings, he gives the metaphor of prayer, saying that it's like when you're a ship at sea and you're anchored and you pull at the chain that's connected to the anchor. It's not that you're pulling the anchor to yourself, but you're pulling your boat towards the anchor. So he uses this as a metaphor to explain how prayer, like God is the anchor. So by praying to God, we're not really drawing God to us, but we're elevating ourselves through this chain to reach God. And you find the exact same metaphor and an image in St. Dionysius. So when we're talking about lexical parallels, it's not just that, they talk about God as being incomprehensible and infinite. It's not these sort of
very precise parallels,
very precise lexical parallels, and then once you add them up, you see a clear tendency in the Alexandrian school that these writings were known there.
Yeah, and so and we'll unpack this some more in a little bit, but to make clear to people, not only does it conceptually sound the same in English, like when you look in the Greek, there's precise Greek words which are the same. So it's clearly that they're thinking of this, something's the same. They got it, one got it from the other.
Yeah.
Would be the most likely interpretation. Now, let me push back a tiny bit, and you push back as hard as you want because you're making the case. And let's talk about the Euthymeic history. Now, generally, it's dated to like the 6th century, which would be pretty late, and when the Dionysian corpus is already out there. So, if that were correct, that would make what you're asserting here really not very relevant, because we would just have a hagiographic source from the 6th century that St. John of Damascus quotes later, which is how we have the Euthymeic history, and it would just be mentioning another supposedly 5th century, 6th century source. So what is your argument that the Euthymeic history really could be dated to the time of, say, Juvenal, which would make it more relevant as an evidence?
Yes. So this is a phenomenon you come up against when you start researching the Dionysian corpus. So anytime there's a reference pre-6th century, the scholars just say, and that there doesn't seem to be a way to kind of question it as saying it's an interpolation or whatnot. The scholarship just says, "Oh, this is later. This is false." And the only reason they give to justify that is, "Oh, well, they quote Saint Dionysius, and we know that Saint Dionysius only wrote after the 6th century." So it's this faulty circular reasoning that you see, and even the Greek patrology, like they have a footnote there on that page where Saint John of Damascus quotes the Euthymeic history. And that's all they say. Like they don't provide any other justification. They just say, "Oh, Saint John, seems to be quoting this work, but this work mentions Dionysius, therefore it must have been written, recently before Saint John wrote." So it's not really a good argument.
So what would be, whether from manuscript or from eternal evidence, that the conversations that are recounted within the Euthymeic history would be, let's say, 5th century? Because generally speaking, a source that recounts an episode, right? Because it's pretty much an episode. The Byzantine queen essentially contacts, the Bishop of Jerusalem, find out, what's going on here and all this stuff. So like it's like an episode that's recounted, and usually like when we have an episode recounted, it's at least written decades or 100 years or so later, because the genre of speaking of something as an episode. So I'm just curious if you have anything, whether based on manuscripts, based on other contemporary sources that might make reference, or what your evidence would that be, or would you simply just push back and say, well, you're just presuming it's early because of Dionysius, but that's just not evidence in of its own right. All we have here is a source that recounts a conversation, and this source is considered credible by other early church authorities. I mean, I'm just wondering where you're coming with this.
Yeah, so on your point about historical sources being written afterwards, that's often the case, but a lot of these sources, especially when they're quoting letters, like they have these archives in front of them, and they have primary sources that they're incorporating into their accounts. You see this with Procopius or some ancient historians like Thucydides. So these letters are preserved indirectly through the historical quotation. And look, there might be question marks about when exactly this history was written, because it only survives in a fragmentary state. And if I'm not mistaken, I think this is one of the 2 fragments that we have. It's quoted at some other point by someone else, but the major fragment is this quote by St. John of Damascus. So ultimately, we can't really know, but to just discount it from the top, saying that this can't be authentic, and that therefore, and let's assume that it was written late, right? It doesn't mean that the story that it's transmitting about Saint Juvenal quoting Dionysius and sending this in a letter to the empress doesn't mean that that's inauthentic. It could be a late source that's quoting an authentic early letter. And then what we do in the book is we place this testimony of Saint Juvenal within the general context of the 5th century. So we say, okay, assuming that Juvenal did know of Saint Dionysius, this wouldn't be an outlier in the 5th century, because at the same time we have Saint Cyril, who seems to have a knowledge of Dionysius, and Proclus himself, which the critics admit, but they think the dependence is in the other direction. So let's say we assume that, okay, Juvenal did know Dionysius. It wouldn't be something strange or hard to believe, because we have other contemporary witnesses who seem to be interacting with this text at the same time.
And for those who want to maybe follow up on this themselves, I believe the whole fragment's preserved in the 3rd Dormition homily of St. John of Damascus, which, if you have the book on Dormition homilies by Brian Daly, Father Brian Daly, you could read it yourself. It's translated into English. So I'll commend people to that, the follow up. Now, let me ask this question. Now, you've brought up very compelling evidence already with St. Gregory and with St. Dionysius of Alexandria quoting citing and or quoting the Dionysian corpus. But even then, we would say, well, it doesn't appear to have been ubiquitous in the early church. Like Eusebius of Caesarea never mentioned in his history, for example. And so let me ask you this. I mean, what is the nature of works that we take today we have no problem with, like, let's say, St. Athenagoras or something like that, but they've been preserved in a single manuscript?
Mm-hmm. Yes, so this is something in our modern reality that we have to forget when we're looking back at the ancient world. So we're looking at an environment where printed books didn't exist. Each copy had to be transcribed by hand, and often at great expense and with great effort. So libraries in the ancient world, for example, the library in Caesarea, which Eusebius drew on for his writings, in his church history, he says openly, what I'm writing, I'm basing myself on the archives of Caesarea, which were largely compiled by Origen and then by his successor Pamphilus. So these libraries were basically the product of individual scholars, collecting works that interested them and sharing them. So it's possible that a work might have been preserved in one area in one specific library that wasn't in another collection. And you see this process even in the canon of Scripture, where in the early centuries you had some writings which were, for example, the 3rd epistle of St. John, which aren't attested until quite late. They were eventually admitted into the canon, but they were specifically questioned because they weren't referred to by earlier authors. So is it good if we have early attestations of a text? Yes, because it helps prove its authenticity, but we shouldn't discount a text simply because it was rare and it's not quoted a lot. That's not a good argument.
And as your book shows, like, it's not like this guy's like Athenagoras. It's like stuff from St. Justin Martyr. Just literally one manuscript preserved it. And I'm actually going to skip ahead in our questions. I'm going to ask about the Dionysian writings in Alexandria, because the Dionysian corpus is not easy reading I presume in Greek or English. My question to you, is it harder to read in Greek than it is in English translation? What's your opinion?
It depends on the translation. A lot of the more recent translations, they try to smooth out the syntax and the grammar, so it's more pleasant. But for example, the translation that we quote from mostly in the book, it's from John Parker, who wrote in 1897, 98. And he tried to preserve the original kind of syntax and language.
Yeah.
So yeah, you get a
It's tough
sense.
reading.
It's yeah, not
Tough
the
reading.
easiest thing to read.
And so the reason I'm bringing that up is a very obscure, very eclectic sort of book. It's not going to be as common as easy reading or liturgical reading in the early church. But it seems pretty clear that in Alexandria, everyone knew about this book because writer after writer after writer, Christians, even pagans, seem to be aware of this book, which
Yeah.
it's because there was a library in Alexandria, but which must have had this book.
Yeah.
So I feel like this may explain, well, there wasn't a lot of manuscripts around, but there was one around where it mattered, where a lot of important people would have had access to it, which have been in Alexandria.
Yeah.
So let's talk about what's your evidence that the Dionysian writings were known in Alexandria? And so let's just start with that. Let's get into the details like of Pantaeus and Clement Alexandria and etc.
Sure. Yeah. So I mentioned the example of Clement, the metaphor of a prayer as an anchor. But if we want to jump back just a bit more in time, so Pantaenus, who is thought to be the teacher of Clement, again in one fragment, which is also preserved by Saint Maximus, so which is interesting, because this fragment that's preserved by Saint Maximus is accepted as authentic. So then that begs the question: well, why shouldn't we accept the other fragment by Saint Dionysius of Alexandria that's preserved? So he has this doctrine in Pantaenus has this doctrine where he's saying God knows creation not after existing things, but it has his own volitions. So the idea is not that God has a unitary knowledge of all of creation in his mind because he willed it into being. So he's not like a scientist who's out there in the world making observations and seeing things externally. He knows the actual essence of things created. And this is a very Christian doctrine because you don't find this in paganism and Neoplatonism and Stoicism, which held that either the world is eternal or that the world is somehow a mirror of God's essence. So there's sort of creation. It's a process of like emanation from the divine. Yeah. There's not this idea of will. So it's very interesting that this very unique Christian doctrine that's preserved in this very old 2nd century theologian, you have the exact same words that are used in Dionysius, where he says, God does not learn existing things from existing things, not knowing them by sensible perceptions, but as divine and good volitions. And the word that he uses in Greek, thelimata, is the same as Pantaenus. So
and so we have Pantaenus. We talked about Clement. We talked about Dionysius. How about Origen?
So Origen, yeah, it's very interesting. You have a wide variety of allusions in his writings. One interesting allusion is in this book on the resurrection that Origen is said to have written, which is preserved in fragments again. And he's giving this defense of the resurrection of the body, which is a common theme in writers of the period. You find it in Athenagoras of Athens and some other apologists. Yeah. And the argument they make is basically this: if you believe that the soul will be in paradise with God, the soul will enjoy this state of bliss. The soul during your life here on earth, it was united to the body, and the body toiled with the soul, it cooperated with the soul. So it would be unjust for God to reward one and then not resurrect the other, or just leave it in destruction and not resurrect it. So this very, very specific metaphor of like the soul as a partner of the body, as a partner in the struggle, in the contests, being rewarded together. You find the same language in the ecclesiastical hierarchy, where Dionysius names the bodies as the yoke fellow and companion of the souls who fought together with their divine struggles and will receive in return imperishable immortality. So that's just one example. But then in another treatise, the commentary on the Song of Songs that Origen wrote, you have, again, very strong borrowings in terms of how do we conceive of love? What is love? Origen says that love, there's three motions to love. There's love from God, the love we direct towards God, and the love towards our neighbor. And this whole doctrine of love is described in great detail in Saint Dionysius, whereas in Origen it's in a very short and abbreviated form. So it seems again that Origen is the one who's borrowing this doctrine from Dionysius.
Because he's fleshing it out. He got an idea and then he fleshes it out.
Yeah, exactly.
And so, right, so we have Pantaeus, Clement, we have Origen, then Dionysius of Alexandria, as he already mentions it. So this is all through Alexandria. We talked about, let's talk about Plotinus. Didn't Plotinus write in the late 3rd, early 4th century from Alexandria?
He was born 204, around 204. He died 270. So he was
okay. So he's around the same. So he's actually in the mid 3rd century. So what's Plotinus's connection to the Alexandrian Christian school?
Yeah. So this is a little known fact that Plotinus's teacher was Ammonius Saccas, who was a famous philosopher of the period. He's referred to by Porphyry and Proclus, and Ammonius was a Christian. So the teacher of the great Neoplatonist was actually Christian. And then there's solid evidence to support the idea that actually Origen was a fellow classmate of Plotinus, and that this explains these very sort of novel doctrines that you find in Neoplatonism of Plotinus that have strong parallels to Christianity, which aren't found in earlier Middle Platonism and Plato's writings.
And so does Plotinus have also those same sort of etymological parallels, like with certain technical jargon that's found in Dionysius?
Yeah, so I'll read you quite a literal quote. So this is in the Enneads 6. So Plotinus is talking about the power of the mind and how we use the power of intellect. So he says, the mind has both the power for thought, by which it views what is in itself, and another by which it knows what is beyond itself through a certain advance and reception. And this is, it's a novel thing you find in Neoplatonism of this transcendent union of the mind with God. The idea that like God is not subject to reason, but you have to go beyond reason to apprehend the divine. And of course, this is like one of the main themes of all of Dionysius's writings. So that was Plotinus. This is what Dionysius says: we ought to know that our mind has both the power for thought, again in Greek, exactly same words, through which it views things intellectual, and a union surpassing the nature of the mind, through which it is brought into contact with things beyond itself. And again, the same words in Greek.
And so, obviously, Proclus wasn't born now for like another 150 to 200 years, right? So we already have Plotinus with the same Greek words as Dionysius, and we don't have people arguing that Dionysius stole from Plotinus, he stole from Proclus, but yet we have this in Proclus and Clement of Alexandria and Origen and everyone that happens to be in Alexandria, just to double down on that point. Now, after Proclus, we have this from the audience, which is St. Jerome has an interesting comment to Pope Damasus about a certain Greek, and he quotes the Latin, who explains the role of the seraphim in purification, other parallels to Dionysius. And he mentions that Jerome also was a student at Alexandria and of St. Gregory. So is this something that I don't remember that in the book, but my memory might be terrible. But it's, do you have any comments on that?
I did not come across that in my research. I know that Pope Gregory, in his Morals on Job, he does refer to Dionysius, similar to that quote as sort of secondhand, saying, it is reported to me that a certain a venerable father named Dionysius has this teaching about the angels. So I don't know if maybe that's what they're referring to.
Maybe he's conflating the stories there, because I do remember that was St. Gregory, but it's so There you go. It's good that we address that from the audience. Um, Now, let's talk about, I think, the most important person in Alexander, Cyril of Alexandria. So, how about proof that he knew of the Dionysian corpus?
So in terms of extant writings, we have no explicit reference in St. Cyril to St. Dionysius. However, we have references in antiquity that Cyril had these letters that he wrote where he does quote from St. Dionysius. And this was brought up at a conference between the Orthodox and the Monophysites in 532. And they stress this point, saying, we have these documents in the old archives of Alexandria where St. Cyril quotes Dionysius. So either way, we don't have these writings, so we can't control the citations, and we can't definitively say the fragments. However, there is in his commentary on Habakkuk, where St. Cyril uses an expression. Let me just find this for you. Yeah, so he refers to God as the Son of Righteousness, the intellectual morning star, rising in the hearts of believers. So these expressions, the first Son of Righteousness, that's from the prophet Malachi, and the morning star rising in the hearts of believers, that's from St. Peter's second epistle. But what's interesting is that the only writer to use these two quotations together and then to link the idea to add this notion of the intellectual morning star. This comes from the celestial hierarchy, where Dionysius says, the divine revelations extol God as the Son of Righteousness, morning star rising divinely in the intellect. So this seems at least...
So we have the same application drawn from the same passage.
Yeah. So it seems if we do accept the Monophysite claim that there were these archives in Alexandria where St. Cyril quotes Dionysius, this seems to corroborate it, because it's a pretty good allusion in one of his existing writings.
And it's interesting because if you notice, when we talk about Cyril and we talk about the work we talked about from Origen, and when we talk about Dionysius of Alexandria, we say we're talking about fragment. Apparently, a lot of works in Alexandria are just completely lost, right? And so, what is the significance that it's not just simply Dionysius writings that were on the rare side in Alexandria? Mm-hmm. It seems like mainstream guys, like a whole saint's corpus with Dionysius Alexandria, where his whole corpus essentially is now lost.
Yeah.
What is the significance of that?
So you have other writers, for example, Clement of Alexandria. We have his what's called in English his Miscellany, the Stromata. He had another writings, another book which was called the Hypotyposis, which were commentaries on various things in Scripture. So this was extant at the time of St. Maximus. It was extant at the time of St. Photius in the 9th century, because he refers to it, but this is lost now. So this is like a good example of a major Alexandrian text that the early fathers had access to that we don't anymore.
When it comes to obscure text, right? There'd be a major library in Alexandria, or maybe a major library in Constantinople, and if Mamluks or Turks or whomever burn it all down, it's gone. Yeah. Right? It's like, the Fifth Ecumenical Council today only exists in its entirety in Latin, because the Greek was lost when Constantinople fell.
Yeah, that's a great point. And also, we're constantly rediscovering works, authentic works that we thought were lost. So a great example, a great parallel to this would be Aristides of Athens, was a close contemporary to Dionysius. He wrote what's thought to be one of the earliest apologies of Christianity, which inspired Justin Martyr. And this work is referred to by Eusebius and Jerome. And then by no one else, if no one else quotes this, the writings disappeared for over 1,000 years, and they were rediscovered in a Syriac translation in 1889. And then they were translated back into English. And these are, accepted as authentic in biblical scholarship and patristic scholarship. So this whole idea that, the fact that you discover a writing and has to be false or inauthentic, it's not true.
Yeah, like if they discover it in the 6th century, oh, it had to be a fraud. But you discover in the 19th century, it's legitimate, right?
That's it. Yeah.
Like, you know, the book of Enoch in Ethiopia had to be legitimate because they found in the 1700s. Something found in the 6th century, 5th century can't be authentic.
Yeah.
I do think it's worth bringing out that the Alexandrian thread is something where it's too much to ignore. Clearly, this work was in Alexandria or came out of Alexandria. And so then the question is, why couldn't a later writer schooled in the Alexandrian tradition, right, have really digested it, have written Dionysius works, right? As in just like he was very creative and he understood the Alexandrian tradition, and that explains why he made a very Alexandrian sounding work. And or is vice versa the much more the simpler, more compelling explanation?
Yeah, so yeah, that's the main counter argument you would, I guess, encounter, which is saying, well, okay, these lexical parallels, they're all true. We give you that, but the dependence is the other way around. It wasn't Saint Gregory who's quoting Dionysius. It's Dionysius who's incorporating Gregory's language into his own works. So why is that not convincing? I'd give you the metaphor of a river. So imagine pouring dye in a river, and the water brings it downstream, and then it leaves traces, on the riverbanks. So the further downriver we assume the person poured the dye, the more individual parts of the riverbank that he had to physically travel to and paint. Whereas if we assume that the source was upriver, you could very easily account for all the later testimonies by simply saying they were all drawing from that one fount in the 1st century. So I find it personally very hard to believe that some person, for some reason, I think this would be the only case of this ever happening, kind of created this pastiche of, Plotinus, Proclus, Dionysius, Cyril, right? He took all these, elaborate metaphors and then digested them and then incorporated them into this consistent language and theology in these treatises.
Which we'll unpack about the consistency of language. Yeah. There's a certain Occam's razor here where how does something find itself in both the pagan and Christian works, and even amongst one of these writers where he quotes that these works even exist by name, and someone seeing that quote like, it'd be great if someone now invented it, and then so thoroughly comes up with it. Like, it doesn't defy the laws of physics, but it's obviously it's a much more complicated explanation than just saying, yes, this work really did exist, and presuming it doesn't have anachronisms and let's say words that are anachronistic or something. That would be the more compelling, simpler historical interpretation. And we'll return to more of that as we go through some of the other evidence. Now, a lot of the evidence you've put forward has to do, yes, sometimes you have someone like Dionysius Alexandria, or you have St. Gregory, where they're flat out quoting it. And they're saying, this a source, or Dionysius says this. But what do we make of a lot of these 4th century and earlier, usages of words and very similar parallels, but not really quoting or citing the source? I mean, more broadly, because I think if we look at this more broadly, it will help actually answer that question. Did the fathers of the 4th century make recourse to earlier sources? Why or why not?
So it's true that the fathers, they do quote the early apologists and the early writers. So we have a good parallel case is Methodius of Olympus. He's a lesser known writer, lived in the 4th century, wrote these philosophical defenses of Christianity. He quotes Athenagoras of Athens, who lived, good 200 years before him. And if I'm not mistaken, I think this is the only reference to Athenagoras in a later church father. So Athenagoras, even though his writings are accepted as generally authentic, the only person really to quote him is Methodius. He's not mentioned in Eusebius, he's not mentioned in Jerome, he's not mentioned in the other fathers. So it's a phenomenon that did occur. We have Jerome quotes this early dialogue of Jason and Papiscus. This thing doesn't survive anymore. It's referred to here and there. The Cappadocian Fathers, they quote Origen. So there's this process of referring to earlier theologians. So that definitely, it's not an outlier. However, when we're talking about major apologetics, there seems to be this tendency in the 4th century that the fathers tended to shy away from quoting these individual saints and preferred to rely on quotations of the Bible. Now, why is that? Well, if you try and put themselves in their shoes, they could have produced a quote from Athenagoras or from St. Dionysius defending the resurrection or whatnot against some heretic. But that person could always say, oh, well, you interpolated that work. How do I know that's authentic? So recourses to the Bible were much more, they were considered of a better apologetic, it was a better strategy. Because everyone accepted the Bible. They had many copies of these writings in Greek and Hebrew. They could even refer to the Jews' copies if there were questions. So that discounts the claim saying that the early fathers don't quote Dionysius, therefore.
They don't quote him enough, because he's not quoted at all.
Yeah.
They don't quote him enough.
Yeah.
This is something that you bring out. Father Dimitri Steniloi brings out in his treatment, in his introduction to the translation, I believe, and also something scholarship talks about, by the way. It's in, for example, one of the chapters of Chalcedon in Context. People have read that book. And it's the idea that it's not that fathers like St. Irenaeus or Eusebius of Caesarea, they won't consider earlier ecclesiastical writers authorities and quote them as authorities. They do. They don't do so commonly. The apologetic discourse was, as you pointed out, and as like these sources pointed out, was from the Scriptures.
Mm-hmm.
And so, let's say a Protestant would be like, oh, well, this shows how the early church argued with one another. It was just Bible battle. And what's often missing from that context is the early heresies in the church tended to be all outside the church. So they're writing against Gnostics of one sort or another, usually. And when they're writing against people completely out of the church, they have to appeal to sources that they would have in common, and both lay claim to a certain, at least, body of scriptures, right?
Yes, very true.
And so it makes sense to appeal to those scriptures in theological debates. Now, as the debates started becoming within, I would say heresies within the church and not out and out schisms. So like with Apollinarians and with semi-Arians, and then you start getting with monophysites, and then, and on you go, where you had almost in-house debates that became future schisms that were of a theological nature. The employing of fathers became more and more common. So like when St. Augustine debates the Donatist, the earlier Carthaginian councils and the inheritance from Cyprian becomes something that's relevant at that point, and then you have to deal with it, right? And not just the scriptures, because now they're talking about a common tradition that they actually do share, unlike, let's say, when you're writing against heretics that were totally out of the church, like the Gnostics.
Yeah.
And what it eventually becomes is almost, I would say, scriptures, I wouldn't say take a backseat, but they take a passenger seat, and you literally will have scriptures first, and then they'll go through florigelia of fathers on topics like diotheletism or whatever, because the in-house debates almost become purely on, all right, we all quote the scriptures against each other, so we need to settle this with the Father.
How do we understand the scriptures?
Yeah, because, you say you understand it, we say understand it. Well, we're going to show you the fathers understand it our way. And when they started doing that, then both sides would inevitably go, well, we have fathers that understand it our way. And the other side say, no, those fathers agree with us and not with you. And the heretics, and they'll make florigelia of heretics. The heretics agree with you and not with us. And that's the nature of theological debate. Now, why did I go on this aside? You could see for a work as eclectic as Dionysius, the idea that he would have been quoted by name a lot simply because he was a first and second century, or allegedly second century author, would have not been immediately relevant in the polemical context of the 3rd and 4th centuries. But it starts becoming relevant in the 5th and 6th centuries. And that would be true of pretty much any father. And so I think this is something people have to take into account. How many fathers will you have quote Irenaeus until you get into the 5th century, right? You might only find him quoted in Eusebius.
Yep. That
doesn't mean Irenaeus' writings didn't exist. And so the fact that we see something from Dionysius Alexander directly cited, right, once by name and once a passage quoted in a tribute to a father, twice, sounds a little, but it's actually kind of par for the course for pretty much any ecclesiastical writer being quoted during that era, if you understand how they would cite things and why they'd cite things. So it's an interesting point that you bring up, that Stan Alloy brings up, that scholarship's aware of when it comes to the nature of ecclesiastical disputes, but for some reason is not appreciated when talking about the history of the Dionysian corpus. So I'm happy you bring that up.
And if I could just add something to what you just said.
By all means.
When the writings of Dionysius do start being quoted more commonly, like you say, it's in the 6th century during the Monophysite debate. But what's very interesting is that it's not one party over the other that's quoting Dionysius more. And this has been established now in modern scholarship, that the Monophysites quote him, the Orthodox quote him at the same time, even the Nestorians were quoting him. So if we assume that these writings are a forgery made to advance the interests of one party over the other, it's very strange that basically the whole Christian East simultaneously accepted them as authentic at the same time. One interesting image or metaphor I came across that one author gives to this is saying, imagine Luther or Calvin had forged a bunch of writings, and then simultaneously, the same century they were written, the Roman Catholics start quoting these as in support of Roman Catholicism, and then the Council of Trent starts quoting these writings. It's absurd. This idea that some Monophysite person forged Dionysius, but then the fathers of the time were just too stupid enough to realize that what they were quoting was actually heresy, and now it's incumbent upon the modern scholars to figure all this out and say that, oh, in fact they were originally Monophysite, but then they were misunderstood and people thought they were Orthodox. So I don't know if that made any sense, but what do you think of that?
I was so distracted, honestly, doing this other stuff on the computer. I missed the point, but I'll let the audience digest that.
Okay, we'll see if they have comments at the end.
So this is YouTube where we don't make money. So sorry, I'm a super interviewer guy here. All right. So let's now talk about the liturgical rites in the corpus, some of the eternal evidence that it's early. So what are some of the early liturgical rites that the Nicene corpus makes mention of?
Yeah, so it's very interesting. Dionysius provides the earliest attested description of a liturgy. It talks about the Eucharist, talks about Holy Unction, baptism by triple immersion, presence of godparents, the sign of the cross. He also describes the physical space of worship, that there was an actual place called a church, what he calls it the sanctuary, but it's essentially the same concept. And then within this place there is a Holy of Holies, which would be correspond to the altar, which was separated from the main sanctuary by gates. Talks about prayers for the dead. He has a very clear knowledge and description of the various orders in the church, catechumens, the faithful, monks even, who he calls therapeutes, deacons, priests, bishops. So basically the whole structure of the church is found in his writings.
And so, while there'd be people that could get into the nitty-gritty of how some of these things show the earliness of the church, because, like, let's say the doorkeepers would have not been relevant to a 5th century writer, but more relevant to a 1st, 2nd century writer. They would make sure there aren't people that are, let's say, I don't know, rats or spies looking in on the church.
Mm-hmm.
In the liturgy today, we say the doors, you know, and again, this would have been addressed to the doorkeepers. Some would look at those same things and go, well, this shows it must have been later, because they're presuming these things were not as early as they were. And they'd make that argument about monasticism, which, you know what, we'll address now. If I see it later, we'll just skip over it, which is, it does give a very specific word for monastics. What's it? Therapeut? I'm trying to remember.
Therapeut, yeah, exactly.
And it gives a very specific word for monastics, but it's not a common word, but it is found in one other 1st century source. What source is that?
In Philo of Alexandria, the Jewish writer. Another Alexandrian connection there.
And so, there you go. So Philo of Alexandria, what does he describe these people are that Dionysius makes reference to?
Yeah, so Philo, as people in the audience might know, he was of the priestly descent or no, sorry, I'm confusing with Josephus. But anyways, he was an early Jewish writer in Alexandria, had access to a lot of traditions there. And he describes in one of his treatises, on the contemplative life is what it's called, this group of people. He doesn't really say if they're Jews or not. And he says they were found across Egypt and Greece. They would live in solitary places, like outside of walls or cities, in desert places. They would practice chastity, abstinence, and they would retire to individual cells called monasteries. They would gather every 7th day in sacred assemblies. They would interpret the prophets allegorically. They would eat a all holy food. They would have vigils, both the men and the women. They had antiphonal chanting. They would refer to the respected members of their community as elders. So you have all the elements really of Christian monasticism in these groups. And Philo refers to these people as therapeutes, which, as you say, is a very rare word. It's used in some other church fathers, but in the sense just of generically as a servant. So like St. Gregory will talk about David as the therapeut of God, meaning the servant of God. But
he's not using it in the same technical way.
No, it's the only other place in all of Greek literature where you find this usage is in Philo of Alexandria, 4th century, and in Dionysius of Alexandria. Dionysius of Athens, 1st century.
Yeah, Dionysius the Areopogite. Very, very, very interesting. And before those who say, well, there's no monastics in the 1st century, which Philo would obviously show, no, that's not the case. We have even the scriptures where it speaks of the widow list, and we know from St. Hippolytus' apostolic tradition that those on the widow list were essentially paid to pray. They were essentially retired nuns of the sort. We also know from the life of St. Anthony that nuns were initially more common than monastics, but it says that they weren't common in those days. Doesn't mean that they were non-existent either.
Yeah.
And so we sort of find that there's these false presumptions of what didn't exist in the 1st century, which aren't true. And then on top of this, we have a technical Greek word used in a very specific sense, identically by only 2 1st century sources. Or Dionysius, the person who wrote Dionysius, and we'll get back to this, is a genius. Read the. He was a genius either way, but he was an ultra genius. He read all the Christian sources, particularly the Alexandrian, read the pagan philosophers, read also the Jewish philosophers, and knew to lend credibility to his forgery took a very specific term for monk used by Philo and made sure he used it for that reason, right?
Yeah.
So it's not impossible, but again, it requires a sort of precision that doesn't exist in forgeries. It's a very precise way of doing it.
Yeah, it strains
It's
credibility.
very, very interesting. Now, there was some people that took issue that supposedly that, oh, well, he makes mention of there being physical church buildings and stuff, and those didn't exist until Constantine legalized the Christian religion. This is clearly not true. You know, we have second and third century sources talk about church buildings. We actually have in the Areopagite a preserved church building. Not everyone was just meeting in a Christian's living room. That's just not true. It's a stereotype that's just not true in early church history. And so, being that these things that supposedly didn't exist are all found in pre-Nicene sources, what are, and this is maybe a more opinionated question, what are the ramifications for Protestantism, right? Not only that these things did exist, there's monasticism, there's church buildings, there's icons, and whatever, but what is the ramification if the Dionysian corpus is authentic to Protestantism?
Yeah, so if Dionysius is authentic, which I wholeheartedly believe he is, then he disproves these certain popular notions of Protestantism. For example, he proves that early Christianity was liturgical and sacramental. He proves, for example, even if we want to get into the specifics about like what is the Eucharist, in one of his descriptions of the liturgy, he says this is a participation in God. So like he refers clearly to this sacrament as being God. So that could be relevant to, you know, the later debates that occurred about transubstantiation. But I would take a broader view. So what does Dionysius actually prove? What is his theology? So there's two elements, these common threads that go throughout all of Dionysius's treatises. And this is important to understand his writings. So the first thread is basically the idea of the divine gloom, which is the expression comes from the book of Exodus when Moses goes onto Mount Sinai and he enters into the divine gloom. So the divine gloom is an image of the complete transcendence of God, saying that God cannot be apprehended by the human mind, the created beings, because he is so bright, like the sun. You can't look at the sun directly, so he dwells in unapproachable light, as St. Paul says. So the other side of the coin, if you will, you have the apophatic side and you have the cataphatic side. The other side of the divine gloom is the notion of divine hierarchy. And divine hierarchy is the idea that God, even though he's transcendent, he shines down his energy and knowledge of himself into the created realm, and each created being assimilates and reflects this light to the degree that they are worthy and capable of. So, for example, one saint might be greater than another. One interpreter, one father might be more enlightened than another father. We have some angels that are archangels, others that are angels. So we have different levels of participation in divine. And what that means is that for those of us on the lower levels of that scale, we have to look to the guidance of those who are higher up above us, who are more enlightened, for them to help us draw near to God. And how this relates to Protestantism is that this completely deconstructs the Protestant notion of the primacy of the right to personal interpretation, saying that, okay, look, we have the Bible, and then we just read it and we understand it, and then there's a equality, the priesthood of believers, and we're all equal. Dionysius completely goes against this notion, saying that no, there's some people who are enlightened. Theology is not just an academic endeavor; it's a participation, it's an activity, and that this is precisely why we trust the fathers and the councils, is because it's not just your own personal intellect; it's referring to the guidance of those who are higher up on the scale.
Yeah, I would say for Protestants listening to this, they should listen two different ways. And one should be for the historical case, just in your good judgment, whether it is more compelling that these sources are authentic. And then you have to then approach, what do these sources say? Because if they're authentic and we accept this historically, we have someone who's mentioned in the Acts of the Apostles, and we see him doing theology in such a way no one in Protestantism does, right? And it demands the question, why? Why would the disciple St. Paul do theology this way and not your communion do theology this way? Why don't people in your communion appreciate this sort of theology? Who does?
Yeah.
Right? These are very important questions that someone have to ask themselves. And it's sort of, in a sense, I feel the edifice of Protestantism is almost built upon St. Clement of Rome's letter not being discovered yet, the Ignatian corpus being not true, and the Nicene corpus not being not true. Because if you had Clement's letter, you accept the Ignatian corpus, and you accept the Nicene corpus, it's sort of like, why are we doing this anymore? It becomes indefensible.
Yeah.
Theologically and historically and ecclesiastically and in every sacramentally in every single way. And so it's because there's process to follow this channel. I'd say I know that's a lot to digest because, quite frankly, most people can't digest the Nicene corpus. So hence, look at the historical case. That's something you're more comfortable with. And if that's the more likely case, and this is most likely authentic, then you have to ask yourself those other questions. So that's where I would leave that. It's a very, very interesting thing to think about. Now,
I could just add one more point there.
Sure, go right ahead.
And this explains the animosity that the early Protestants like Luther had towards the Dionysian corpus. Luther, openly attacked Dionysius in the worst terms as some type of Platonist who knew nothing about Christianity, just talks about monks and rites and sacraments. So what people have to understand is that the same thing happened to Saint Ignatius's letters. The same things that they were saying about Dionysius, they said about Saint Ignatius, but Ignatius was vindicated, and people accept it as authentic now. So all we're saying in this book is that the same process that happened in the Renaissance with these early fathers happened to Dionysius. Is just for certain reasons that he was never really rehabilitated.
All right. Now, speaking of the way this corpus was accepted in church history, were the Nicene writings ever really in doubt? So, like, people would cite the first time the Diophysites, which would be the Chalcedonians, heard of it. Supposedly, this is what people popularly remember. Supposedly, like, we don't accept this; these are forgeries. So, like, is that really true? Were these writings ever in doubt among the Chalcedonians? Were they accepted among everyone? Can you get into details?
Yeah. They were, as I touched upon briefly before, they're quoted not only by the Monophysites, but they're quoted at the same time by Saint Ephrem of Antioch, not the Syrian father, in the 4th century, a later father. They're quoted even by the Nestorians. So there's no one community that laid claim to these writings, which in itself suggests that they're authentic. Because if everyone's accepting them as authentic, it seems, as you said it before, it's more of like an internal family dispute over common writings than a debate with a community that didn't accept common writings with you to begin with.
And as you point out, it's some detail in the book, and people could get more details there, that the debates between Severus and the Chalcedonians that St. Justinian held together, and where people usually say, well, this shows you that they rejected them at first. They weren't really explicitly rejecting the Nicene corpus. They were rejecting that perhaps the Florengium they were using of it had wrong things in it, because that was very common back then.
Yep.
So that's something that people have to take into account. It's not that they were saying Dionysius of the Areopogite never wrote anything. It was they weren't sure if some of like new theantic energy and stuff like that were things that were actually there because they didn't have it in front of them at the time.
Yeah.
Now, what do we make of the early occurrence of terms like hypostasis, meaning like in reference to like a particular hypostasis, and unconfused? And the reason I bring that up is oftentimes they'll say, look, This proves anachronism within Dionysius' corpus, because no one used the term unconfused until Basil of Ancyra, I think it was, in the Council of Chalcedon, and then it was used in its decree. Is that true?
So no, that's short answer is no. It's again this bias that the early Christians just they just had the Bible and nothing else, and these rites developed slowly. So like the early Christians could not possibly have spoken about God in this way, which is a silly argument if you think about it, because the apostles had direct access to the Word of God, the fountain of knowledge. St. John the Evangelist is known as the theologian. So to think that these early Christians just were stumbling over themselves and just didn't have the right words, it's kind of on its face a bit not very smart. But specifically to your point about hypostasis and unconfused, let us see here. So hypostasis does occur in early writers such as Origen. So he talks very clearly about the three hypostases: the Father, Son, and the Holy Spirit. And this is not even controversial. It's mentioned like on the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy. It's a known doctrine of Origen. Clement of Alexandria again uses hypostasis in a similar sense as person. But if you want to discount all of that, just read third verse of the opening of the Epistle to the Hebrews, where St. Paul, who's the putative teacher of St. Dionysius, says that Christ, being the brightness of the Father's glory and the express image of his person, hypostasis, that's the King James translation, and upholding all things by the word of his power, when he had by himself purged our sins, sat down on the right hand of the Majesty on high. So it's a term that occurs in the first century.
And it's also, by the way, I'll just add this in the interview because it's not in the book. It also comes up in St. Hippolytus when he talks about his arguments with who was that pope at the time that he really didn't like? Well, a couple of them, but anyway, against the modalist, against Sabellius, he uses the term hypostasis with the meaning of particular hypostasis. So this shows you like East and West and the Bible. This kind of there's a Cappadocian particular hypostasis doctrine, but it was not like something they invented. It has earlier precedent, even linguistically, in earlier sources. Now, how about and if I have the right word, without confusion, that you quote St. Hippolytus about that? Do you mind telling the audience how this term is not something that's just first found in Chalcedon, and we have something in St. Hippolytus, the same word?
Absolutely. So St. Hippolytus, this is in an excerpt, fragment of his commentary on Proverbs 9:1, where the image is wisdom. How does the verse go? Wisdom prepared her meal, and she mixed wine in the bowl. So he's providing an interpretation of what this passage means. And then the fragment attributed to Hippolytus says, quote, "The Savior, uniting his Godhead like pure wine with the flesh of the Virgin, was born of her at once God and man without confusion," asynchitos in Greek, without confusion of the one in the other, which is the exact same way Dionysius uses it.
And it's the same exact word that's used in Chalcedon.
Yeah, exactly. And then that word is also attested in Philo, in a different sense, obviously, but clearly it existed in the first century.
So pretty much, again, this brings us, like we were talking about with the question about the Alexandrian corpus, what is the simplest explanation that, the Dionysian corpus precedes Chalcedon and St. Hippolytus, or this person was a super genius. He knew all the pagans, the Jews, and everything in Alexandria. He also knew everything from Chalcedon, and he put this all together.
Yeah.
Again, that's possible. Both are possible. The question is, what's more likely of those two possibilities?
Yeah.
So that's something very interesting. So let's get a little more into linguistics. Niccolò Sassi, which I'm sure I'm pronouncing wrong, did a linguistic analysis of two works from Dionysius the Areopogite.
Yeah.
And so could you summarize his findings and tell us why they're relevant to this question?
Yeah, so there was an Italian scholar in 2017, 2018 in the search.
So this isn't a 100-year-old scholarship. This is recent.
Oh, this is very recent. In the search, the perpetual search to find who the Pseudo-Dionysius is, trying to pinpoint who this man might be, he looked at descriptions of the nature of God and the kind of mystical union with God that occur in the corpus, specifically in his letters, Dionysius' letters, and his mystical theology, which are the two shorter works that exist. And he used an interesting method, which it corroborates what instinctively you comes across in the treatise, but he provided now official statistical evidence for this, which is what are the sources, what is the nature of the vocabulary that's used by Dionysius. So like we could talk about individual examples, hypostasis and confused, but this is really a broad statistical analysis of the general tendencies in his writings. So what Sassi found, and this was consistent in both the mystical theology and the letters, was that about 60% of Dionysius's expressions are completely original. They don't occur in any other writer in Greek, not only ecclesiastical Greek, like pagan writers. They're sort of outlying expressions and specific to this treatise. About 20 to 30% are philosophical terms. So neither Christian nor pagan, just sort of learned terms that would be used by the fathers or by the pagans in the various schools to talk about what is essence, what is essence, accidents, life, vital things of this nature, right? And then 10% are specific Christian or biblical expressions like the divine gloom, which I mentioned before, or the word theandric, divine, human, right? And this is a word that occurs only in Dionysius and then in later fathers who are presumably quoting Dionysius. Yes. So what's the conclusion? What do we draw from this? Is again, so Sassi, he still holds to the pseudo-Dionysian view that this person wrote later, but even he, in his conclusion, he's forced to say that either this person was some type of genius who quoted all these various sources and had a perfect mastery of the pagan and the Christian tradition, or he even suggests that the writings are a product of some type of circle of scholars, of many people who wrote these writings, which I think is hard to believe given the consistent voice that we find across this whole thing. So
if you had a circle of scholars, you would have one statistical, the proportions of words that are original and from pagan, and from this would be from one scholar this proportion X, and then from the other book would be proportion Y. It wouldn't be the same.
Yeah. No, there's a consistent voice, consistent style throughout all the treatises, which belies that theory.
Now, like the only the forgeries that I've only been studying any sort of detail from the primary sources would be those from Anastasius the librarian. People found my channel know all about that, and the Eric Knibbs with the studies of the Pseudo-Dionysian decretals, and if you get to the methodology, how I would say the most elaborate set of forgeries that we acknowledge are forgeries and have proof, because we actually have 9th century manuscripts where we could find where they picked out the other manuscripts to make these forgeries from. Okay, so that's how we have proof of it. Of these Pseudo-Dionysian decretals, is that they would purposely take excerpts of papal correspondence, and that way, when they made some sort of new correspondence, because they're copy and pasting words, it would sound like papal court. It would sound real, right? And that's why duped people for so long. Now, with the alleged Pseudo-Dionysius, he has this very specific sounds that's only to himself, right?
Yeah.
Like he has a peculiar voice that's only of his own. He gets proportions, as you point out, from pretty much everywhere of where these words come from. And then he has an original vocabulary that's solely his own. It would be many folds more elaborate of a hoax than the Pseudo-Dionysius decretals, which are acknowledged to be pretty much one of the most elaborate hoaxes in history. And so, again, opposed to the audience, it's not that it defies the laws of physics that a super genius could put this together, but even comparing what the Dionysian corpus is against other against known hoaxes, it is that much more elaborate, which then makes it that much less probable that it's a hoax in of itself. And this linguistic analysis from Niccolò Sassi is fairly recent. It's within the last 10 years. So whether you have Solzhenitsyn or whomever else these modern scholars talking about, I forget who translated in like 1987. Who was part of that?
I forget his name. Was from the Paulist Press.
Pelikan or something? Was he part of that? He wrote the introduction.
Yeah, it was written by a variety of scholars. Yeah, but the main translator was Lubheid, and then the critical edition was prepared by Beata Sukla in 1990.
So that being said, it's Yaroslav Pelikan, at least I think he wrote the introduction to it, if I remember right. But anyway, all that aside, it's like they didn't, even recent scholars and people in the know didn't have access to this sort of linguistic research. I mean, this is that new. And so when we have better evidence, we have to start reevaluating our conclusions. We can't be like, oh, well, the time-honored tradition of academics is just to say it's a fraud, right? Yeah. Because you have to go to the evidence, because we have an even older time-honored tradition that says it's not a fraud. So then what's the evidence say? And it's very interesting. Now,
and I'll give one or two other examples to the audience who might be interested. In terms of how elaborate this hoax would have had to be if it's indeed a hoax. Dionysius, in one of his letters, he uses an expression that's only found in Attic prose writers, Plato, Demosthenes, Lucian. He uses, for those who know some Greek, the dual number, which is an archaic grammatical case to refer to just two objects, has its own set of declensions and endings, right? You only find this in very learned writers in Attic prose. Wasn't commonplace in the 5th century, even in like the educated writers like St. Gregory the Theologian, let alone to someone who wrote in Syria, who might not even have had Greek as his mother language. So this is whatever you might say about the author of these writings, everyone admits this is top quality Greek. So whoever wrote this is really put a lot of effort into it, and to say that it's not even like and I don't know if he's doing the right word. So it's not really medieval Greek. It doesn't have like Neo-Attic. It's Attic Greek. It's Attic Greek, specifically.
It's Attic Greek. It's old. Yeah. Oh, well, let me pose you this question then. What evidence do we have that Dionysius the Areopogite was really in Athens at the Areopagus and would have been awash, amidst all this Attic writing?
It's
a trick question. It's Acts chapter 17.
Acts 17, right?
Right? So it's like, so it makes sense the actual historical figure from a 1st century source is identified being somewhere where he would reasonably actually be well informed in these sort of things. And the fact he's called Dionysius the Areopogite, he would have already been known in his day as someone that was learned in these sources. I mean, that was his name. Like, that's what they called him.
What do you know? The writings that an educated Athenian is said to have written in the 1st century look like they were written by an educated Athenian.
Crazy stuff. Crazy. And again, it poses back to the question, is this the most elaborate hoax ever made by one of the most intelligent people ever? Or is it just a very intelligent Dionysius the Areopagite? It's what's more likely? I mean, it's a very good question. So let's now get into a very specific term, and it's the term par hypostasis.
Yeah.
Why is this term par hypostasis relevant? And could you explain Dionysius' doctrine of evil and how it points to a Christian origin?
Okay, so this is connecting now to the second major argument you mentioned in the beginning, which is the relation with Proclus. So I'll start by explaining a bit of the context here briefly. So Proclus was a 5th century Neoplatonist philosopher. He was born in Constantinople. He was initially studied to be a lawyer or an orator, but he fell in love with philosophy, so he went to Alexandria, where he studied for several years. And then he eventually settled in Athens, where he taught at the academy. He's a kind of unusual figure because he provided the paganism's dying breath, the last defense of polytheism philosophically in the modern era. So he wrote, Proclus wrote after the time of all the great fathers, after a lot of the councils, and even the terms that he uses, he talks about hypostasis and essence and the paternal cause. So he reads really like within that world as a Christian, and this explains his reception in the later Byzantine period, where he was attacked not so much as a pagan, but almost as a heretic. The type of vitriol and responses you find in the later Greek writers in the Middle Ages against Proclus, he's really seen as this villain figure. Now, related to the parahypostasis and the doctrine of evil, why this is relevant is because Proclus wrote a treatise on the existence of evils, is its title, in which there are many passages that are almost word for word what we find in the divine names, specifically in the second half of book 4 of the divine names. And I'm specifying that because people tend to, there's this common opinion, there's this common belief that Dionysius, all his writings are just dripping with Neoplatonism, and that every page, every sentence is attributed to Proclus, and his influence is everywhere. Actually, in terms of actual facts, the parallels to Proclus are about 6%, 5%, and they're restricted almost exclusively to this single portion of the divine names, which deals with the nature of evil. Okay, so all that being said, what is Dionysius' nature of evil, and what is Proclus's? So Dionysius, he basically resumes what you find in all of the other church fathers throughout the first 4 centuries, which is the Christian doctrine of evil, that evil does not have an existence on its own. It does not have its own hypostasis. That's why he says it has a parahypostasis, a dependent or parasitical existence. So it's similar to the idea of light, Darkness is an absence of light. It's not a thing in itself. It's an absence of a positive. It's a negative and there's a positive. So this is basically the doctrine that Dionysius talks about in the divine names. And this is also the doctrine of Proclus, who uses this word. So the question is, did Dionysius take this doctrine from Proclus, or did Proclus borrow it from Dionysius?
And then let's follow that up on then who exactly was Proclus?
So Proclus, he was a Neoplatonist philosopher, so he was writing in the tradition of Plotinus, but like I said, he tried to offer a philosophical defense of polytheism using Platonic philosophy, even though the terms that he used and the concepts are very reminiscent of Christianity. So in short, yeah, that's who Proclus was, and like I said, he did study in Alexandria too, so that's another Alexandrian connection.
Well, and let me ask this then: is it more likely that the full body of Proclus' works would have been cherry picked and then condensed into a portion of divine names? Or is it more likely that Proclus would have had only the divine names in front of him at the time, or only committed to memory the divine names and then had those ideas repeated throughout his works? I mean, what is the more probable?
So we get into great detail on this aspect in the book. We devote about 50 pages just to Proclus and Dionysius, and there's when you see the writings parallel one to the other, it's clearly much more likely that Proclus was borrowing Dionysius than the other way around. And I'll give you some examples. So Dionysius, as we touched upon before when we mentioned origin, he shares this idea, this theory that there's three motions of love. There's the love you have towards your superior God, God's providential love towards what's inferior, and then this mutual bond of love between equals. So then in one of Proclus's commentaries on the first Alcibiades, he's talking about the question, do the gods love? Because he's trying to explain, how do we make sense of these stories of Aphrodite and Ares and all the gods committing incest and debauchery with each other. So he's saying, do the gods feel love? And he quotes lexically what Dionysius says, but he instead of saying that there's these three levels of love from inferior to superior, superior to inferior, and from equal to equal, he just abbreviates it, and he says there's two motions. There's the providential love of the superior to the inferior, and the love of the inferior that the inferior has to the suppliant love that the inferior has towards the superior. So if you're just looking at these texts, it's more likely that Proclus is the one abbreviating Dionysius, rather than believing that Dionysius was reading some commentary of Proclus. He happened upon the specific analogy, took it, and then expanded it in a way that's consistent with what Origen and himself were saying about these three motions of love throughout all his treatises. So it's more parsimonious to believe that Proclus is abbreviating Dionysius.
And it's basic common sense. Like, what are the chances you purposely take just one writer, right? Not other philosopher, one writer, take his whole body of works, not just one of his works, the whole body of his works, and then condense it to just one small portion of your own fraud.
Yeah.
Right?
We have passages. So there's passages in Dionysius where you have, one sentence corresponds to one treatise of Proclus, and then the sentence right after corresponds to another treatise of Proclus. So are we to believe that Dionysius had all these books open before him and he did this pastiche where he took one sentence from here, one from there?
Let me word this very simply. It's easier, right? The path of least resistance would be, instead of having one other person's whole body of literature and use it to write, just to make this simple, one book, it's easier to consider that other person had one book and used that one book throughout writing his whole body of literature.
Yeah, absolutely.
That is obviously the simpler explanation, right? So now we already have that simpler explanation. And then, as you bring out, you have Dionysius making these examples, and they're not condensed, they're fleshed out, they contain internal parallels, which, when to purposely dispute Christian conclusions, you have to break the parallel. Yeah. So Proclus will copy the same thing and then break the eternal parallel because he wants to disagree with the conclusion. It starts becoming a burden of evidence where I feel that the person trying to defend that Proclus was the source of Dionysius, it borders on conspiracy theory, because it requires way too much effort for that to actually work. It's really interesting, and let's zero in on a specific set of words: supersubstantial flowers. Yeah. All right. What does supersubstantial flowers have to do with anything?
So it seems very abstract, but I'd say it's the smoking gun. If there's one thing that blows this case wide open, it's this. So So Proclus, in his treatise on evils, he's referring to the kind of the henads, or what you could say that are his principles of being, and he calls them various things, and then he says we can call these things supersubstantial flowers and lights and things of this sort. He almost throws in this description towards the end of his passage, so it's almost as if he's quoting someone. So.
And as you point out, the scholars think he must be quoting a now lost, right?
Yeah.
Chaldean oracle. Like it has to come. So it's not you being crazy.
Yeah.
Everyone agrees something's being quoted.
Yeah.
But the scholarship, because they have to write off Pseudo-Dionysius, he comes after, of course, Proclus. So what's being quoted can't be Dionysius. It has to. He must be quoting a now lost, a mysterious third thing.
That's right. Yeah. So. This idea of supersubstantial flowers, it's the same image and same words are found in the divine names with reference to the persons of the Holy Trinity. Dionysius says all these things spring from the one essence of the Father, and the Son and the Holy Spirit are, so to speak, supersubstantial flowers and lights. So this idea of the Son and the Holy Spirit as flowers from this common root of the Father, or lights springing from this one source. This is a classic Christian metaphor. You find it in Tertullian, you find it in Gregory the Theologian, you find it in Synesius of Cyrene, who is a writer who wrote 50 years or 30 years before Proclus was even born. So to claim that this is some type of pagan expression from the Chaldean oracles, really, it doesn't. The weight of the evidence doesn't bear that out. But even more so, at the very beginning of Proclus's treatise on evils, what does he say? He says, "The arguments I'll be making," I'm paraphrasing, but the arguments I'll be making below are but summaries of what my predecessors have said. Whereas Dionysius, in his divine names, he says, "Everything I'm saying I have taken from the theologians," meaning like the prophets and the Bible and the kind of Christian tradition. And God forbid I use a source that contradicts the theologians. So just on the face of it, you have the same term occurs in both writings. One person basically saying, "I didn't get this from anyone."
I got it from someone else.
The other person is saying, "I got this from someone else." Well, who do you think that other person is?
Well, let's follow up on this. How's this dovetail to another early writer, Synesius?
Yes,
or Synesius.
Synesius, yes. So he was a little-known figure. He wrote some beautiful hymns in Greek. He was a bishop, I believe, in Palestine, Caesarea. So I'll give you his date. So he lived circa 373 to 414. Whereas Proclus was born in 412, so he's clearly writing before. So as we mentioned, so people to refresh their memory, Dionysius says, "The Lord Jesus and the Spirit are, so to speak, flowers and supersubstantial lights of the God-bearing deity." Synesius, in his hymn 2, he says that in his poem, "One fount, one root, a thrice resplendent form has shone, for wherever the paternal depth is, there is also the glorious sun. The unifying splendor offered up a wealth of blessings, and a supersubstantial shoot, teeming with fruitful movements, sends forth the wonderful lights of the blessed existences." So,
and just a quick question: what is supersubstantial in Greek?
It would be hyperousios. So hyper is above, and ousios is substance. No, the word he uses is hyper, not epiousios.
Okay, and so we have Proclus, obviously preceded by Christian writers, all using this term. And Proclus quotes that he gets this from someone else, and admits he gets the arguments from other people.
Yeah.
And so this clearly came from Christianity. Why would Proclus have quoted a Christian author, and why would he just not mention Dionysius by name?
Okay, yeah, that's a very good question. So this goes into the conspiracy aspect you touched on. So Proclus studied in Alexandria. As we mentioned before, there was an established there was a closeness between and an interaction between pagan thought and Christianity in Alexandria that we see in Plotinus. We see it in Ammonius Saccas being a teacher of Plotinus, Origen interacting with Platonic thought. We have Clement of Alexandria, who says, whatever the pagans have said that is correct, we take it and we use it. And then we have the pagans, like a Platonist called Numenius. He quotes the Old Testament. He even said famously, "What is Moses? But what is Plato but Moses speaking in Attic Greek?" So there's this close cultural, melting pot, if you want to call it, intellectual melting pot in Alexandria. We know that Origen taught pagans. He himself talks about this. We have Eusebius who confirms this, and then we have Proclus himself who quotes Origen in 3 times. Once in his Platonic theology, and then in his commentary on the Timaeus. So then you'll have people say, "Oh, it's a different origin. This is it's a Platonist origin," but again, it's that same argument saying it can't be the same person because why would he quote a Christian? But I leave that for the audience to decide. We put all the scholarship in the footnotes there. There's this one scholar, Ilaria Ramelli, who makes a very strong case that there was one and only origin. Even Porphyry, he says Origen, the classmate of Plotinus, was a Christian. So it seems to be it's the Christian origin that Proclus is quoting. So within this environment, like I said, of close intellectual influence of Christianity on Platonism, Proclus is there. He already quotes Origen. And then he writes a treatise where he says, what I'm saying is a summary of what my predecessors have said, in which he quotes Dionysius. So it seems to be very logical that a very logical thing for Proclus to have done. Why does he not mention him by name? My feeling is that Proclus generally had a negative view of the Christians. He never mentions them by name in his treatise, although he often has some sort of side swipes that he'll say. He'll refer to them as those who move the things that should not be moved, or the impious ones, or so forth. So, and then also, like I said, he makes use of terms that the church fathers use, like substance, hypostasis, transcendence, these concepts, but he turns them and he uses them in a pagan sense. So I think it was in Proclus's interest to use Dionysius, just like he used Origen, but to kind of conceal his source as a safeguard against people telling him, "Oh, well, you're just quoting the Christians, so why shouldn't we accept what they say as true?" So he was using Dionysius and twisting him to serve his own pagan theology.
All right. Now, let's get into some eternal evidence in the corpus that points to an early dating. Like, what would you identify as just details that, instead of being anachronisms, would only make sense if they're written at the 1st or 2nd century?
Yeah, so we talked about the term therapeut, which occurs in Philo. And I would say I would phrase it in the following way. The general dogmatic concerns that we find in the Dionysian corpus fit perfectly within the context of early Christianity, specifically 1st and 2nd centuries. Nowhere in the treatise do we have any heresies that are mentioned that occur later. The main concern of Dionysius seems to be two opposite poles. On the one hand, you have the Judaizing tendency, and then on the other hand, you have Gnosticism. So on the one hand, he'll attack Simon Magus, who is the heretic mentioned in the Acts of the Apostles, for denying the resurrection of the flesh. And he's going to interact with his doctrine very precisely showing that he knew his writings or was very well acquainted with his theology. On the other hand, he'll refer to these certain materialistic interpretations of God, which were current in the Jewish tradition, and he'll say, no, it's improper to think of God in this manner, and he'll provide his interpretation. So all the concerns that seem to be present in the treatise fit perfectly within the mindset of an early Christian and what the reality
Now, how do we
was.
have the details about Simon Magnus? Is that from Irenaeus?
That's from the Refutation of All Heresies, which is attributed to Hippolytus. So that's
Okay.
3rd century, yeah.
And so for someone to, again, make this elaborate hoax, they would have had to really get these details from St. Hippolytus, from an earlier source, and that would have not been as popular. Some other refutations of heresies that would have been extant in that day. So that's something that's interesting. There was a couple things in my own reading that come up, which are eternal evidence, which are very subtle.
Okay.
One is he calls Saint Timothy, he called him deaf to his writings, which is an interesting, I don't know what it is in Greek, but it's kind of an interesting comment. Like he's writing the Titus, right, of the Bible, of biblical vintage, and he's writing, and he mentions that, oh, he was deaf to my writings, which kind of means like blind, or like he didn't understand.
Yeah.
And maybe it's because it's a reference to the writings being read to Timothy, right? Why the word deaf? I don't know. I'd have to, you know better looking in the Greek. But that being said, like, think of a forger. Could you imagine a forger making a kind of like side comment like that about an apostle and saint? That, oh, they don't understand what I'm talking about, right? Like, usually no, because like when the hagiographic glosses of the past always make like where the saints always got along, which, you know, we know from the scriptures and their own writings, right? Like Acts of the Apostles gives a much more positive portrayal of you know, St. Paul and St. Peter, let's say, than what you get in Galatians. What do you get in Paul's actual writings, right?
Yeah.
Usually the people writing for themselves, kind of, you see their personality and the things they don't agree with, and it's a little clearer than when someone else writes on behalf of their friends, right?
There's a naturalism in the writings that is very, very prominent.
Yeah, so like you said, this is a detail, an eternal detail that is very hard to explain with a later forger. It's not something that, again, super genius could think of textual criticism, which didn't exist then, and then apply those sort of things and go, well, I'm going to make it look like to a text critic, you know, in the 19th century that this is authentic and we have this detail. I mean, it's unlikely. It doesn't defy the law of physics, but very unlikely. So that's something I would point people to. Another interesting thing is the only thing I'd say in the whole Dionysian corpus that's like borders on normal to read would be his letter to St. John in Patmos, which makes sense. He would have been writing to a living apostle that knew the Lord, and maybe you were going to be all, you know, highfalutin to him. You know, like you're going to tone it down a tiny bit. So it's an interesting internal detail that you see, because to everyone else, he writes as he always writes, with his very peculiar vocabulary and highfalutin theology.
Yeah.
Another detail, which is interesting, which never gets mentioned, is there's a source, and it's a Gnostic source called Ascension of Isaiah. And this probably was only discovered in the 19th century or even 20th century. I don't know the exact when we found this source. It's dated to the 1st or 2nd centuries. I personally date it to the 2nd century because there's a passage, the 1st century, because there's a passage, and there's passages in Ascension of Isaiah that parallel very closely with 2nd Peter when it comes to like them expecting the coming of the Lord and things like that, like details that were more relevant, where people were like, why isn't Christ back yet? We thought he was coming back within our lifetime, sort of deal. And so it comes up in the source as an eternal detail, which I think lends credibility to it being authentic. Now, authentic to the 1st century, it's a heretical work otherwise, but at least we know it's an early heretical work. Now, that aside, the Ascension of Isaiah's description of heaven and the hierarchy of angels and the grace that's passed on from angel to angel is an idea that's also found in Dionysius, but it's not something I find in other Christian sources or later Christian sources. So what's the relevance of this? The relevance would be that it shows you that some of the philosophical ideas of Dionysius at least were of his time.
Mm-hmm.
All right.
Interesting. Yeah.
And it's because not a lot of people are doing the cross-disciplinary research. They're not the people that, let's say, investigate Dionysius are looking at, they might be looking at Proclus and Dionysius, but are they looking at Philo and Dionysius? Are they looking at Gnostics and Dionysius? Right? Are they looking at Hippolytus and Dionysius? So it shows you when people have blinders on because they're only experts in 5th century philosophy or whatever, right? Then that's all they could see. But someone with broader background can now start bringing in other sources. And so I'm far from an expert in this, but because I've broadly read even the Gnostic sources for 2nd, 3rd centuries, you start realizing, wait, this is something from a 1st century source.
Mm-hmm.
And it crosses into Dionysius. Why? Right? Like, what are the chances of that? It's very interesting.
Okay.
Now, let me pose you with a difficulty, and we've talked about this via email, which is there's an eternal detail, which I think may be inconvenient to your case for Dionysius being authentic, which is he makes mention of a Clement the philosopher.
Yep.
And it does seem like he's quoting the Clementine homilies. And the Clementine homilies do contain like stuff from Arianism and whatnot. All scholars believe that there's at least 4th century interpolations. But interestingly, the scholars also think that the original source starts going back to the 2nd century, right? But they use textual critical arguments. And so it seems to me you now have to make a defense that the text criticism of the scholars is correct, but for the Clementine homilies, because you almost need the Clementine homilies to at least have an authentic core that's from the early 2nd century, or otherwise it proves that the Dionysius who wrote was gathering sources that were early, but he himself wasn't early because he quotes the Clementine homilies. So I would like if you could get into some detail about that.
Absolutely. So people could know what we're talking about. I'll read the quote. So this is in Divine Names, chapter 5, book 5, chapter 9. So Dionysius says, "Now, if the philosopher Clement thinks good that the more important things among beings be called exemplars, paradigmata in Greek, his discourse does not proceed according to the proper, perfect, and simple naming." So he's attacking this term, the use of this term, exemplar or paradigm, with reference to created things as a way to know God. And he attributes this doctrine to a philosopher Clement. And this is one of the few references by name to a person in the Dionysian corpus. We get Simon Magus, like I mentioned before, and then we have the various apostles, but it's quite rare that he'll openly quote someone. Okay, so the question is, who is this Clement? The only other Clements it could possibly be is Pope Clement of Rome, or the later Clement of Alexandria. But it doesn't seem, at least to me, that it's either of these people, because the doctrine that he's quoting, it's not found in like the Clementine epistles. It's not found in Clement of Alexandria, and even the way that he refers to this person as the philosopher, and then he takes this rather negative assessment of him. It seems a bit jarring if he was referring to Pope Clement, a fellow disciple of St. Paul. Everywhere else in the corpus where Dionysius mentions a Christian author, he always gives him the title of divine or holy. So Holy Paul, Divine Paul, Holy John, Holy Ignatius, Divine Ignatius, and so forth. So that got me thinking, what other person could he be referring to? And as you say, there are these homilies which are attributed to a Clement who lived in the early centuries. And this body of homilies, it's essentially a record, purports to be a record of the oral tradition of St. Peter. It mentions various debates that he had against paganism, talking about the nature of God, quotes from what you'd refer to as agrapha, so lost sayings of Jesus. You find these things in the Clementine homilies. And the homilies themselves, they claim to be a version or a copy of the preaching of Peter. So now this preaching of Peter is mentioned in early writers. So we find Origen quoting this text called the Preaching of Peter. We have Clement of Alexandria in the 3rd century who quotes extensive passages from the Preaching of Peter. And then, very interestingly, we have...
And do those passages match the Clementine homilies?
No, they don't match what we have of the Clementine homilies, but it's similar in substance. So in terms of the kind of quotes of Jesus that you find, or the kind of descriptions of God as being divine and transcendent and timeless, it's similar to what you find in the homilies. And there was even a German scholar who, I believe correctly, identified this preaching of Peter language in the Apology of Aristides of Athens. In two parts of his apology, he seems to be quoting lexically, though not by name, this preaching of Peter. So that's why scholars have dated this preaching of Peter text to around 80 to 140 AD, sometime end of the 1st, beginning of the 2nd century, which would correspond perfectly with when Dionysius would have been writing these texts. So, of course, there's various scholarly debates about what is the relationship between the preaching of Peter and the Clementine homilies. Are the homilies a later recension of this preaching of Peter? Were there many preachings of Peter? There's all these questions. But I would just put it to the audience: if we have at least some evidence that there was this text called the Preaching of Peter that was contemporaneous with Dionysius, and that Dionysius is quoting a text that seems to be this text, I don't think it's out of the question to assume that this is the Clement he's talking about.
Yeah, it's unlike a lot of the other things we've discussed here, this one has multiple layers, right? And it doesn't mean it's not true, but right, when we deal with probabilities, this is, I'd say, the weakest link, and which would be good fertile grounds for further research and for people to get into. I do think, like you said, you make a compelling argument. We don't have evidence to the contrary because it's vague and mysterious. But it is something that is worth people digging more into. Let me address this because it was one of the audience questions, and we touched on it in that reply about Saint Ignatius, right? So he quotes Saint Ignatius as this commenter says, one argument I've heard is that Saint Dionysius quoting the letters of Saint Ignatius proves that the writings couldn't possibly be from the 1st century because Ignatius wrote in the early 2nd century. So why is this relevant, right? Like if St. Paul shows up in Athens, I'm going to just say around the year 55 AD, right? And if Dionysius is already the Areopogite and he's already pretty learned and he's already, been around the block a few times, right? And this is before, I presume, the Theotokos had died. He's going to be about 30, I'm going to guess, in the year 55. So for him to then quote St. Ignatius' writings, at most maybe 50 years later, year 105. So Dionysius had to be 80 when he quoted that and was active writing. And so contextualizing this, is that too unlikely? Why do you think you quote St. Ignatius? How does this affect how we would date the Dionysian corpus?
Yeah, that's a good point. So St. Ignatius, the letter that Dionysius is quoting, is thought to have been written around 108 AD. So if Dionysius, we know that Dionysius wrote a letter to St. John when he was in exile on Patmos, so that gives us the dates of between 96 and 98 AD, which is when St. John was exiled under the reign of Domitian, and he was called back under Nerva, I believe. So Dionysius was active, so we have proof from the corpus that he was writing towards the very end of the first century, and the letter he's quoting by Ignatius was written and sent and circulated to the Christian communities in the early years of the second century. So I don't think it's much of a stretch to say that he wrote that he quoted Ignatius. Why would he quote Ignatius? These letters that Ignatius circulated, they were similar to Paul's Catholic epistles. They were meant to be circulated to all the Christians, and there would have presumably been a knowledge of these things in the Christian communities, which were still very small. But however, even if we assume, let's say this is, it's not a real quote. Actually, St. Maximus in his commentary, when he's looking, critically at this passage, the quote by Ignatius almost seems to interrupt the other quotations that Dionysius is giving. The specific quote, it's about the God as love. So Dionysius is giving quotes from Scripture where Scripture refers to love as eros, the carnal love, as opposed to agape, the more Christian love. So he quotes two passages from Scripture. He says, I will quote Scripture showing where this word occurs. Then he quotes one passage. Then he says, oh, by the way, Ignatius mentions love too. And then he says, okay, and then this word eros occurs in this other part of Scripture. So Maximus said it's possible that a later redactor added this into Dionysius's treatise because he remembered that Ignatius had used this word as well and added it inside. That's possible. However, I would just add to that Origen in his Song of Songs, commentary on the Song of Songs, where he's also talking about the word love, eros, he provides the exact three testimonies that Dionysius also quotes, the same two biblical testimonies and St. Ignatius. So it seems if Origen was quoting Dionysius, that the text that he had in front of him by his time in the early 3rd century was already interpolated or already included that reference to Ignatius.
Yeah, so like whether it's a marginal note, like written on the side that then found its way into the text, or just was just a parenthetical statement that was original to it, it's not really anachronistic, because the idea that someone would be writing when they're 80 when he was writing when he was 70, right? Like if he wrote to St. John of Patmos, it's he was still writing as an old man either way. So it doesn't make it really isn't a problem. It also kind of makes some sense of eternal details, right? Because if you look at the internal chronology of the Nicene Corpus, he goes, remember when there was the solar eclipse, right? And remember when there was, essentially they were there for the Theotokos when she died and stuff like that. All these implies events that occurred in his lifetime that would have, what's it called?
He was
that he wasn't writing yet, right? So like he wasn't writing, like he might have been writing as the Areopogite back in the day, right? Just like Augustine, before he was a Christian, did write a philosophical work. And so like doesn't mean he didn't write at all per se, but the Nicene Corpus itself doesn't pretend to have been written in the 60s, right? Because it's making reference to events then in the past. And then it makes reference to, I'm going to pronounce the Greek wrong, but Hierotheos, like his teacher.
Yep.
So there's a good possibility Hierotheos was writing and teaching. And so he was being like kind of dutiful as a student and soaking it in and not really expounding things of his own. And so it kind of works the eternal chronology. It doesn't really I would say the tougher thing would be like, how young was he to have remembered the solar eclipse stuff and the details around it, right? That's where you go, was he a really smart 10-year-old or something? And exactly how old he was. But
he says he was in Egypt in Heliopolis together with another Greek philosopher called Apollophanes. So
like were they kids?
were they there, studying abroad back in the day in Egypt to learn?
Right. It's an interesting thing because like it's there are 10 in Egypt, or if there are 20, that pushes Dionysius into his 90s, which again, not impossible, right? I was just at liturgy today, and the 95-year-old priest gave a homily, right? So it's not that old people can't contrive thoughts and explain them, right? But it's
There's
these
a
are
story.
interesting internal. I'm sorry.
Sorry, just to add a funny anecdote. There's a story I encountered doing research for the book. There's a bishop in northern Germany in the 3rd century. He was 80 years old, and they ordained him bishop because they said, "Oh, he's going to die in a few years, and we'll have someone
Like they
else."
did with Francis, and he's still going strong.
Yeah. So they ordained this man at 80 years old, and the guy lived until 120, and he was active. He was, writing letters, going to Rome. He was, very active in his diocese. So the age isn't really a problem.
Yeah, and Ron Paul's still writing and vlogging and stuff, and all sorts of people. So but it does show, like, when we put this chronology together, it's interesting internal details. And you'd think, again, if the person is making it up, he's not going to say, "Oh yeah, I remember that eclipse really well," because now you're already forcing the issue that you have to be that old, right, for it to work. Yeah. But it makes sense if you are that old to be like, "Yeah, I remember that," and that's the detail that's there. So it's an interesting internal detail. Now, what do we make of the lack of introductions and conclusions that are atypical of ancient epistolary that we do see in the epistles? Like, were they in some way already condensed with the introductions and stuff removed? They almost read artificially, like they just jump right into theology. So what's your observation about that?
Actually, I don't see that as a problem. If anything, it strikes me as another naturalistic detail of the writings. If you're exchanging letters from a friend to a friend and you're writing these things quickly, in fact, if you read the letters of St. Gregory the Theologian, I have some examples here. All right, so it's from his collection of letters from the Greek Patrology.
There you go.
So let's see. Yeah, it's full of short little letters that he wrote off. Okay, like look here. This is Epistle 113. It was written. Who is this? Selefsinus. I'm not sure who that is. So this is, like 4 lines.
Yep.
Two sentences, and he just jumps right in. He says, "Do not judge me when I'm silent, and I will not judge you when you speak." So there's no context. There's no "Hi, how are you?" from Gregory to Selefsinus. Just go straight into the topic. And this is not unusual. A lot of his letters are similar.
All I can say is receiving a letter from Dionysius must have been really tough. You get a letter out of nowhere. It doesn't even say hello, and it just jumps into this stuff.
the God man had two energies, 2 wills. Yeah.
So yeah, that's and that's, let's talk about that right now, because we really even talked about that. Let's talk about the theological argument in favor of Dionysius authenticity, in 2 respects. One, right, like, what is don't we as Orthodox Christians have theological reasons where we have to accept their authenticity? And you could even argue Roman Catholics even. And 2, what do we make of just like certain inconvenient theological teachings in it? Like, for example, the natures being without confusion and stuff, which like would have not been convenient for the monophysites that were quoting the text. Yeah. So what are the theological arguments in favor of its authenticity?
So I would say these writings were accepted as authentic by the greatest luminaries of the faith. So St. Maximus wrote commentaries on the whole corpus and assumed they were authentic. St. John of Damascus quotes St. Dionysius as an authority and says he was the most learned, illumined disciple of Paul. St. Photius quotes Dionysius, refers to him as the Bishop of Athens, student of Paul, a great martyr. We have the 6th and 7th ecumenical councils that quote Dionysius. We have all the ecclesiastical writers in the West, going back to the 9th century, Thomas Aquinas, Hugh of St. Victor. In the East, we have St. Gregory Palamas, who makes use of Dionysius almost as his main source. So basically, all of the Christian tradition for the past, for the whole Middle Ages into modernity, accepted these writings as authentic and valued their theology. So to say that, oh no, we moderns now, we know better than the church fathers, it seems very, very arrogant to me to say that all these people for all these centuries were mistaken, and then because of some, contrived abstract philological reasons, we're saying that all these things are forged. And then I'd go a step further and say it seems preposterous to me for those people who say, because you find people like this who say, I don't care who wrote this text, whoever wrote it, I just care about the concepts and the theology that's expressed in it. I leave the debate about the authorship to other people. Let's just talk about his doctrine. But I find you can't separate the person from the works, because how are you supposed to accept Dionysius's word when he's talking about these great and lofty doctrines about what the nature of God is and what reality is, when you doubt his own identity, when he says who he says he is? How can you believe someone, follow him in theology, when you believe that he could have lied about himself so brazenly and so openly?
Now, I want to bring this up, this comment, and it says, isn't the Bibliotheca of St. Photios, he mentions having read a book defending the Nicene authorship of the corpus, but sadly the book's no longer extant. And the point he's making is that, well, that must mean that there are people doubting it. And I want to, people say, well, the smartest scholars of this day, how dare evangelists have a different opinion? The smart scholars of today believe that it's it's a pseudonymous work. But how about the smartest people of church history, right? We don't remember the people that wrote against it back then, but we know Photius, who had the big library, right? We know St. Maximus, who is obviously a genius, right? So that also has to mean something too, that the people in the know of the past had a certain opinion. Yep. So if we appeal to scholarly opinion because they're experts, fair enough. That's legitimate. It'd be a fallacy to appeal to that in of itself. That'd be an appeal authority, but it's a legitimate thing to keep in mind. But in the same way, if you look at the geniuses of church history, Thomas Aquinas, Maximus, whoever they are, that would be our church history, but of Christian history, that has to mean something too, because they were geniuses, right? And so you're pitting experts against experts. So it is something worth to bring up that the experts of the past had this view. Right. And I find this with scholarship where, let's say, I find scholars up to a certain point in history agree with a Orthodox view. And then, let's say, recently, they're now agreeing with a Roman Catholic view. Well, then I could come up with an independent argument that validates the former scholarly view, which shows all those other scholars weren't idiots. Right. So the same way, these fathers weren't idiots. They knew what they were talking about. We also have this,
and that reference to the work by St. Photius. He's the first person to mention this objection. So when we're talking about the critics of Photius's era, who were these people? We don't know. But the one objection that Photius mentions is that Dionysius refers to early rites that didn't exist in the first century. To me, that strikes me as a kind of iconoclastic position, because that's what the iconoclasts were doing, saying that the early Christians didn't have icons. This is a later innovation. So similarly, Dionysius, because he has a certain pro-icon theology, it seems to me it's implicit. And then also the fact that the Photius quotes this work at the very beginning of his Bibliotheca, so that suggests to me that it was some type of debate, contemporary debate, that he cared about. And Photius's family were vigorous opponents of iconoclasm. So even there, the people who were attacking Dionysius always seem to have some type of heterodox, ulterior motives behind it.
No, it's we have this, and I think it's what you're referring to. Isn't the overriding issue regarding Dionysius the church's judgment? and the use which she has made of the writings, and see chapter 2, Mystical Theology, Vladimir Lasky. And again, you are essentially referring to that. Like, the church has made a judgment on this, and a unanimous judgment on this topic. And what we find here is that historically it's consistent with the church's conclusions over time.
Yep.
So let me ask you this. We're going to return now everything we discussed. As a matter of Occam's razor, can you sum up your case to authenticity of Dionysian corpus? That's just the simplest interpretation of all the evidence we have.
Sure. So we have a text whose author claims in the text to be writing in the 1st century. Everything in the text is consistent with someone writing in the 1st century, and the text was received for all of Christian history as being written by someone in the 1st century. So for me, it seems to be very logical to conclude that the Dionysian writings were written in the 1st century.
Yeah, it's like when we're talking about the super substantial flower thing, right? So to presume the normal thesis that Pseudo-Dionysius copied Proclus, that means Pseudo-Dionysius saw Proclus assigning a passage to someone, and he's like, he didn't assign it to a name, so I'm going to give it to myself. But that the same terminology from that passage then is found in Synesius and like, as you mentioned, several other writers that use the same term. And so it's like, it requires a very convoluted explanation versus this Dionysius wrote first and everyone else got it from him.
Yeah.
Right. That actually seems to be the simplest evidence. And to sum it up for people, my own conclusion, evaluating your evidence, and I think very little, I'm not going to put myself up near you, but I've added a couple things to this conversation, would be, if this is a falsely attributed work, it's definitely the most convoluted and well put together fraud in history. And I'll repeat that. It'd be the most difficultly well put together fraud in history. Linguistically, the span of works, the span of genres it covers, the methodology where it creates its own independent terminology and voice, its use of Attic Greek that then stops getting used, its use of terms, theological terms that only had that meaning, like therapeut in the 1st century. It defies imagination. It almost would require us making the argument for authenticity, knowing all those pieces, and then out of some sort of dark motive, purposely now making a new forgery with all that knowledge, right? It requires almost the ability to deconstruct how it's authentic, use that knowledge to then take all those bullet points and make sure to do all those things to make something inauthentic.
Yeah.
And we've just never seen that before in history. The closest is with the Pseudo-Isidore and the Creedals, and ultimately speaking, they contain anachronisms and stuff, which we don't have here. And they don't contain, and with the anachronisms, you don't have theological terms which are specific to a certain period that then drop out of usage, but they get resurrected with the intent of making it sound earlier. And if this author was so intent upon sounding early, he surely would have not used the highfalutin language that he would have, because if anything, it sounds too advanced, right? So he wanted to do something very advanced, but in the language of the ancients to trick everybody, right? When it's just easier, like it just wasn't a trick all along. It's very, very interesting. And just so the audience aware, for me, the real turning point was seeing what's the Greek word? Asinktos? How do you say it?
Asinktos.
Yes, without confusion.
Yep.
Right? Was seeing that in Chalcedon and not seeing that anywhere else. But then when that was found in Hippolytus, and it's in an early 3rd century source from a father who boasts that he has apostolic traditions, it's like, all right, even now the even minute linguistic arguments are failing, that it's a fraud. And it's almost like, as you point out, you almost have to say, well, that fragment with that word is a fraud. And that author that quoted this, well, he's quoting a mysterious 3rd source that they all borrowed from, right? Like you have to almost start creating conspiracy theories for every piece of evidence to just dissuade from the fact that no, Dionysius is authentic.
Yeah.
So I think this might be the greatest thesis of our time, and it's in your $15 book. You'd be an idiot not to buy it, with link below. So it's really, really incredible. And before I would say we maybe talk a little more about your future projects and stuff, let's do some audience questions. And maybe first, before we do that, let's give you, if you do want to make any finishing comments before we do audience questions.
No, that I think sums it up very nicely.
All right. It's sadly not as eloquently as you. But anyway, we have this. Marcus says, Golitsyn goes into great depth in regard to the salient and foundational Christianity that is readily apparent in the Dionysian corpus, including his letters, after the main body of his writings. And so, again, like it shows that we have someone who believes that the Dionysian corpus has a portrayal of church life that's too advanced for its time. And as we covered with the word used for monasticism, the kind of monasticism that we do know existed, the buildings and worship that we do know existed, the anachronism of having doorkeepers and stuff at when they usually attribute the writing of Dionysius' corpus, we actually find, I think, the opposite is the case, right? And so I don't know if there's anything else you want to add to that.
No, I would just say on the topic of rites, we have a whole chapter devoted to that where we show parallels to everything Dionysius says in the early fathers, apostolic fathers, and it's all there, black and white, quoted, so everyone could see it.
One of these quotes will be in a community post, I think tomorrow on my page, quotes from your book, and of course brings people, so copying, pasting your book, but I'm not just stealing it. It will tell people it comes from your book. And it's about chrismation.
Spread the word.
Yeah, there you go. Spread the word, guys. Please share this interview, let people know about it. And it talks about chrismation, right? And so it's easy to go, oh, well, chrismation is something that we only see explicitly 4th, 5th, 6th century sources, but that's just not true, right? And as you detail, it's just not true. And this is for many, many different things that are brought up in it. So how about this question? So I'll be honest, I haven't read these writings in length. They're difficult, so there's nothing wrong with admitting it. But putting that aside, shouldn't we find the kind of theology explicit in the writings in St. Paul? If this is, so his argument is, do you think what Dionysius has is completely consistent with the scriptures, or is it too advanced, or definitely an advancement theologically from what we see in the scriptures?
Yeah, that's a good question. I would say there's nothing inconsistent with St. Paul. St. Paul's writings were addressing a different set of concerns. He was writing Catholic epistles to Christians to deal with problems like idolatry or marriage with pagans or Jewish customs. But we do find this very elevated theology in places when St. Paul says he was elevated to the third heaven. So that implies a type of hierarchy, that there's a first and a second heaven. When he says to Timothy that God dwells in unapproachable light, which no man has seen nor can see, that's basically a summary of the divine gloom, which is the main thesis of Dionysius. And also, everything that Dionysius says about the angels, these aren't just abstract speculations. When he quotes about the hierarchy of the angels, he directly refers to Old Testament verses in Ezekiel, in Isaiah, especially, that describe the angels as acting in a hierarchical order and conveying knowledge of God from above to other angels and men. And then I would
to double down on that.
Yeah.
Acts chapter 7 in St. Stephen's speech, he talks about the law mediated through angels. We see St. Paul talk about that in Galatians chapter 3 or 4. I think it's chapter 3, not 4. We see St. Paul and Colossians speak of the worship of angels. Mm-hmm. What is he referring to in all this? Because this clearly was this knowledge that these angels were intermediaries for revelation.
Yep.
And it could be taken too far, as it is, by the way, in the Ascension of Isaiah, by the way, right? Another first century source. So it makes sense there have been a Christian theology of angels, which put them in their place. They're not gods. They're a media in which God's actual energies then are brought to creation and to man, and God's revelations brought from himself to mankind. And so I see a consistency here. And if anything, it addresses a kind of vagary in St. Paul, but that he takes for granted that you reading it would know. Yep. Right? Like it's like a passing comment that's not supposed to be vague. It's supposed to be like, well, of course you know what we're talking about.
Yep.
And so I think what Dionysius offers us is the orthodox interpretation of what that tradition was and how it was exegeted from the scriptures, as you're pointing out.
Yeah, perfect. Yeah.
We have this comment. This is crucial for the history of philosophy as well. Could you comment on that? Like, how does this change how people would study Proclus and Plotinus and stuff like that?
Yeah, it's a pretty big deal, right? Because the usual canard we have in academia is that the Christians, they were unoriginal. They couldn't come up with anything themselves. They're always borrowing from the pagans. Hypostasis is a pagan term. Essence is a pagan term. They're all quoting Platonists left, right, and center. Whereas this actually, and not only this, but understanding the Alexandrian tradition and origin and the interactions between pagan thought and Christianity, it puts it in a whole different light, showing that actually Christianity was a major intellectual movement in the early centuries, and it influenced a whole bunch of people, including the greatest pagan thinkers.
Yeah, what we find, and this is something like Schumacher has done with Mariology, and some could say too much to some degree, but the idea that everyone was very compartmentalized and there was no exchange of thoughts and ideas between different ethnicities and different belief systems is just not true, right? What we see is, right, they had a teacher that was a Christian. They were a person who apostatized from Christianity. There's someone who converted to Christianity, and on and on we go. So I keep hammering home is we need an increasing appreciation and scholarship for interdisciplinary research. We can't understand one discipline without a general knowledge of other disciplines, because what we find is that one discipline is informed by other disciplines. And that comes out here, I find. It's like one of my things, ecclesiology. You need to know about Jewish synagogal structure to really understand early ecclesiology and stuff like that. We need to have cross-disciplinary research to really appreciate this stuff. So we have this. This may have been answered already, but why is it important to accept the authenticity of these texts? And what do you think is the motivation to deny their authenticity? So Jacob wants to hear your opinion on that.
Do you have a thought on that you want to say first?
Simply, our motivation is that this makes reading church history easier. And why people falsify it, because there's this, I think, since German liberalism with the scriptures, it's this sort of thing that we're smarter than the ancients are dummies. And it almost becomes a caricature. They're literally drooling retards. Everything they thought must have been wrong. Yeah. But that's not a justification for sloppy, bad arguments.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I think there's a certain arrogance to someone who puts Proclus and Dionysius side by side, and they look the same, and they go, yep, Dionysius got to be fake because I could read Greek. But yet they've never done the broader research of what else this connects to. So I think a lot of this comes from blinders. What to allude to before, the scholarship has not become cross-disciplinary enough in the liberal arts fields. In all reality, historians would benefit a lot from studying criminal law and psychology. So that way they can understand human motives and human actions, because sometimes you see the stupidest interpretation of historical source material because they're acting like they're dealing with aliens and not with human beings, right? So again, my axe to grind would be we need a cross-disciplinary approach, and that's what's lacking. And so that's my comment. What's yours?
Yeah, I agree with that. I would just add, when you look at the context that the initial objections to Dionysius started emerging, it's in the context of the Renaissance and the Protestant Reformation. There's clearly an ulterior doctrinal sectarian motivation behind why these things were attacked. And I would just say Lorenzo Val, even though he wasn't a Protestant, but he was sort of an unorthodox writer. He questioned a lot of earlier kind of church traditions. this thesis that he advanced is about this long. It's a paragraph in length. So this idea that he released was picked up and just repeated kind of mindlessly over the centuries, and I don't think has ever been addressed properly, and certainly not to the extent that we do in the book. So I'd leave it at that.
It's well, and you're speaking humbly there. This is comprehensive, how you cover it and in detail, and I think it renders unjustifiable the thesis that the Nicene Corpus is pseudonymous. With, I would say, the real wrench in the works is, like we talked about, the Clementine homilies. There really needs to be more work done there. Not necessarily by yourself. You don't put yourself as the Clementine homily expert, but that's the one weak link on a very strong chain where it's just like, well, what is going on here? And we just need more details.
Yep.
It's very interesting. We see this. I often hear that Saint Dionysius taught energy essence distinction, but how could Aquinas not have picked up on this, basing such a large amount of his work on him? Is there evidence of edits to his work? So this kind of asking almost like for a critical knowledge of the Latin translation. I don't know how much you've thought about
that. I have some small comments I can make towards that. I'm not an expert, but basically Dionysius is in common with other early writers like Justin Martyr and Tertullian. He has this doctrine about the absolute transcendence of God's essence. We can't know what God's essence is. However, we can apprehend God through his manifestation, his operation, his energy into the world. As far as I can tell, that was a common interpretation east and west up until the 12th century. We have Hugh of St. Victor, who wrote commentary on the works of St. Dionysius, where he has a passage in his Summa, which is one of the earliest Summas which was written, and presumably was well known by Aquinas, where he says, okay, provided that we cannot know God's essence, aren't created things a likeness of God, where we could understand them by analogy? And then Hugh of St. Victor, basing himself basically on Dionysius, says, no, there is no analogy between created things and the uncreated. The uncreated essence of God is as different from anything created as the soul is from the body. Now, Aquinas, I know, took a different position. How he interpreted Dionysius to fit with that, I'm not an expert, so I would leave that to other people to look into.
Yeah, it's like I do know the only thing I could comment on, because Dr. Benjamin Heigarkin did in some detail cover how Aquinas used St. John of Damascus exposition Orthodox faith. And if he understood the Greek, Aquinas couldn't derive some of his anthropological conclusions. But the way it was translated in Latin allowed for Aquinas to kind of have these certain speculations at concupiscence that really would be incongruous with our understanding of the passions, blameless and blameworthy. And so I'm not sure. I'm sure there's subtle details like that the same way. I just don't know firsthand because I haven't really read up on that particular subject. We have this question. Could it be that St. Dionysius' corpus were not widely commented on in the first centuries because they were just too profound and not easily digestible in the nascent church?
Yeah, absolutely. In fact, Dionysius himself, in the kind of dedication, as he sends the works to St. Timothy, sorry, one moment, let me just find the quote. He says, he sent the divine names to Timothy, and in the first book, he says, I beg you, do not make the things divine spoken or known to the uninitiated. And then later in the ecclesiastical hierarchy, he says, trusting in thy sacred promises that you will not communicate to any other, but those godlike initiators of the same rank with yourself, and will promise not to communicate the mysteries to God, but to the godly alone. So these weren't public writings that he was publishing for people to read in the from the altar to the congregations. These were specific theological treatises on specific questions that he was sending to Timothy, and he explicitly tells him these things aren't meant for lay people; they're meant for priests and bishops and initiated people into profound spiritual matters.
Yeah, it's I would agree. It was something that if you look at the early works, a lot of them weren't even to Christians at first. They were like the pagan audiences, they're apologetic works. And then when they're to Christian audiences, they're about heresies, particularly like inter-Christian heresies, inter-Christian problems, or ecclesiastical disputes. So then the question then becomes, when would such a eclectic work be relevant in those contexts? The answer is it really wouldn't be. It would be relevant to, who do you imagine? A guy like Origen or a guy like Clement Alexander, someone doing a lot of speculative theology.
Yeah.
But lo and behold, those are the people that do quote the work. So it makes sense within that context.
Yeah.
That is very interesting. We have this. How do we know that Dionysius didn't depart from what Paul taught? If this is the Dionysius from Acts 17:34, I guess my original question got deleted. And so I guess what he's saying is, right, if this is authentic and you're Protestant, I'm guessing maybe Matthew's a Protestant, right? You sort of have to reconfigure how you do theology, like entirely, I was referring to before. And so like we kind of already referred to, this crosses into scripture. Do you have any other comments on like how we would figure that, well, Dionysius wasn't someone like Simon Magnus who was a Christian for a time and fell away, but someone who was, persevered in the faith, and his writings should be taken seriously?
I would say the defining element would be, are these writings consistent with similar things we find in the 1st and 2nd centuries? If you have a painting, a tapestry, and you rip out a piece, and you just have that one piece, is putting that piece back into the tapestry, does it fit with the overall pattern of what you see? So does what Dionysius says in the core about the angels, is it consistent with what is in the Old Testament and the New Testament? Yes. Is his doctrine of the divine transcendence unique in early Christian writing that survived? No. Is his description of Christian rites unique? In some respects, he's the earliest attestation of these things, but these things, they're not unique phenomena that we only find in Dionysius. So are the specific doctrinal concerns that he expresses orthodox? In regard to his attacks on this Judaizing tendency, as we show in the book, Dionysius actually takes an idea that, to summarize briefly, that God had a body, which was a sort of quasi-heretical opinion in the early centuries, which you find in some early church fathers.
They're not talking about Christ's human body. They're talking about like whether the divine essence has a sort of like geographic space sort of deal.
Yeah. So it's a weird early 1st century proto-Kabbalistic doctrine you find that some Christians held and the Jews held, and Dionysius specifically denies this and attacks it. And not only that, but then when he talks about the resurrection, he defends the resurrection. So on every point that you could gauge his orthodoxy, he's a very careful and orthodox writer.
And I would say just the eternal details. He's in the know, right? He was there when the Theotokos died. He is writing to apostles that are still alive, and those who knew the apostles, right? So if the text could be dated to when he's still in the church, then he is, by all intents and purposes, at least at that point when the writings are made, dependable, right? We take it upon tradition that whenever, unless he died with his pen in his hand, the moment putting the period on the last sentence, that he, which we know, by the way, by the book, because we get to find out how he goes to France, right? Which is not what the stream's about. But so that being said, it's unless that is the case, we presume he persevered in the faith, and tradition is he died a martyr, and so. But just based on eternal evidence, the eternal evidence would be, well, yeah, he was writing to people in the church as part of the church. So this should be taken as part and parcel of what the church is. And this, I think, brings apologetics to a whole new level in two ways. One, We have now put the modernist on the back foot that try to take a writing of the saint and say it's really not authentic, and then we don't really have a trustworthy tradition, and the postmodernist way of just grappling their own tradition. So that puts them on the back foot, but now it also puts Protestant polemics on the back foot, because now they have to deal with, we have a first century source to second century source, because he's writing between those two centuries internally, which has the Dormition of the Theotokos, which has the energy essence distinction, which has our sacramentology, has everything. And we could verify linguistically, theologically, in all these different ways that it's most likely authentic. How do you deal with this other than saying, I don't like what it says, so I just presume it's pseudonymous? Now you actually have to make a better argument that historically it's not authentic, because if historically it's most likely authentic, now all your Protestant objections don't even start making sense anymore, right? It's like it's almost like we got to deal with this question of history here with this source before you could even get anywhere else, because we got a very, very thorough first to second century source on so many questions, where if you accept this as authentic, you're converting the orthodoxy, I think.
It's a big elephant in the room for some people. Yeah.
So it's my challenge to Dr. Gavin Ortland. There you go. Is you're going to have to seriously deal with this, which, I'm sure they won't, but we have other good Protestant apologists, like maybe the other Paul, that will take this challenge seriously. We have this. I don't remember if you ever said where you saw Father Dimitri Stanley talk about St. Dionysius the Areopogite. You could find this online. I forget, how do you pronounce it? It's John Diopoulos, or how do you say his name? You know what I'm talking about?
Sanidopoulos?
Yeah, that guy. I think it's a translation of his introduction to his translation of the Nicene Corpus into Romanian. It's not very long. He gives an argument, and to sum up Staniloi's argument, it's essentially, let me just go back in my notes. It's covered, the same arguments is made in this book, by the way. So it's not like you would miss out on anything. But it's essentially says, well, early fathers don't quote Dionysius simply because they weren't quoting a lot of people for the reasons we already discussed here and stuff like that. He also makes the argument that he seems to be rejecting Platonism and first century certain ideas, and Platonism and first century ideas and not later ideas, and which again in a lot more detail we flesh out here. So I think your work has built upon that saint's, he's not yet fully canonized, but that saint's work to show that his intuition was fundamentally correct. And, to not so humbly make a similar connection to my audience that follows my stuff on Anastasius the Librarian. Just yesterday, I read something from the Caleb of Atlanta blog, where they translated book 7 of Dositheus II's Dodeca Biblius, where he makes the argument that Anastasius the Librarian falsified his Latin translation of Nicaea too, right? Wow. So like you have the intuition of this earlier writer, right? Some people consider Dositheus a saint, and there's people now that consider Staniloae a saint. And little you and little me have now come with very concise reasons why their intuition is correct. So this is a very, very exciting time. I have this for you. Will you do something similar with St. Isaac the Syrian? Like, are you going to make a project, right? I think what you did here is a lifetime's worth of work. I don't know if you're going to top this.
I mean, I don't speak Syriac, so it's a way beyond my.
You got a Latin bro, right? You got the Italian guy that knows Latin. We got you. You need to get an Arab friend.
That's right. Yeah, we'll have
find an Arab guy and then bring him into Scriptorium Press. So maybe this is a good time to talk about what is the future of Scriptorium Press? What are you doing? Yep. Where do we go from? What are your future projects? Where can we get this book? I mean, this is important work you're doing. Don't feel bashful. Let's jump into what you're doing with Scriptorium Press.
Okay, so our people interested, they could look forward to in the new year, we will be publishing a commentary on Ruth, Esther, and Judith by Rabanus Maurus that goes verse per verse explaining the context of these books and allegorical connections to other church fathers and interpretations, Christian interpretations of these books. And really, the sky is the limit after that. We have some other saints' lives that we'd like to look at. We have Saint Simeon the Stylite. His life has been, a few versions of his life has been translated, but we have one version that we're working on right now that we'd like to publish. We have some Ethiopian saints' lives, some rare stuff it's never been done in English. A bunch of stuff in Gaul, Martyrs of Gaul, Apostles to Gaul, and yeah, really anything interesting that hasn't really seen the light of day, you could expect to see it.
Well, I'll tell you this. I'm going to make a point of being a completist if anything Scriptorium Press comes out with. Until maybe they come out with a real bad album, right? And then I might stop following, right? But it's
we'll try not to.
There you go. Absolute important stuff. And I will follow up with recommendations of certain Marian Dormition homilies that aren't translated yet. Because that's what I'm into. So that will be there's this really cool, important stuff you're doing. May God bless you, and please pray for Anthony and Evangelos in their work and in doing this and making this publicly available. It's on Amazon.
It's on Amazon, yeah. .com, .ca, .uk, everywhere.
Don't be afraid of scriptoriumpress.ca. That just means Canada. They're Canadian, all right? So don't hold that against them. And but you can also find it on Amazon if you're just a normie American and just want to buy it from Amazon and not feel like it's coming from Canada with maple syrup or something that's going to screw it up. So definitely support Scriptorium Press and their future work. Now, I know we got one more follow-up question, and then maybe we'll call it a day. He says, if Dionysius knew what Paul didn't, was Dionysius more inspired than Paul? And I go, no. I think Matthew needs to know maybe more broadly Orthodox theology, which would be, we see sacred tradition as a unified whole. We see the Scripture and the tradition of the fathers that complement one another. We think the Holy Spirit inspires the fathers. Maybe in a qualitatively different sense than the writers of Scripture, because those are literally the words of God. But God superintends the writings of fathers so that they could teach, as the pastoral epistles even talk about, that God has given bishops the role to teach. And so these fathers, like Dionysius, who is a bishop of Athens, are teaching in their God-given role. And we see that the Holy Spirit superintends that consensus of bishops that are saints to do this. And so you pitting them against each other wouldn't make a lot of sense. I don't know if there's anything else you'd like to add.
Yeah, we shouldn't forget that the writings in the New Testament, a lot of the epistles are occasional writings. They were written for specific purposes that had just cropped up, and they were kept because they were good expositions on this topic that was addressed at the time. So the topic of, specifically the hierarchy of angels, the divine names, were not first and foremost on St. Paul's mind. And when the topic did come up to St. Dionysius, he produced his work. So that's how I would see it.
Now, they say that if we buy it from Scriptorium Press CA, are they going to get maple syrup or Tim Hortons spilled on a copy?
It's possible. I don't know what goes on in those warehouses, but it's always a possibility.
Now, like when they pack the books, are they going to put old wrappers of Thai Express in there instead of newspaper?
Yeah.
That's a Montreal Thai chain. You're not aware. So there you go. It's we don't have more Canada jokes, so we'll just leave it there. Well, Evangelos, this has been a real honor to kind of debut your thesis to the wider world and to debut the book to the wider world.
Thank you for having me, and thank you to your audience for your questions and your attention.
And I will otherwise commend people to the book in the link. And I will end this show, as I end all of them, by quoting Jesus Rock, by saying, fight to death for the truth, and the Lord God will fight for you. God bless you. Have a great day.
Perfect. God bless.